Around the time of Star Wars Episode 7's release, the word soft reboot seemed to enter the zeitgeist. In the case of The Force Awakens, while it mostly retained the continuity of the previous films, it quite closely followed a number of A New Hope's narrative beats. Essentially, it stripped the story down to the bones and packed on new flesh and muscle to, on the surface, look different while not feeling different. The notion of a soft reboot isn't just limited to cinema, however, games have it too, but its definition in all media can be quite broad. It can have a time skip, alternate timeline, be a prequel, side story, you can reboot the whole thing. You've got a lot of leeway, but all of these possible routes tend to maintain their original continuity. So let's get specific to what I'm talking about when I use soft reboot, by describing a game's plot ambiguously. A lone soldier infiltrates a secret military base in the wilderness in order to rescue a high-value target and uncover a legendary group's nuclear-equipped bipedal walking tank. Upon infiltrating the base, he makes contact with the weapons engineer. All the while, it seems like the enemy is one step ahead of his actions, and he runs into a number of highly skilled soldiers who aim to stop his mission. In the end, a traitor is revealed within his team. The soldier then destroys the bipedal tank, and the facility is set to explode. Roll credits. Now, which game did I just describe? Which Metal Gear game did I just describe? Metal Gear Solid. Both Metal Gear Solids. The original 1987 MSX version and the 1998 PlayStation version. Yeah, I've been a bit glib and vague in my summary of the plot, but MGS on the PS1 is essentially a soft reboot. But why did I go to all the trouble to talk about Star Wars and Metal Gear Solid if this is about Tenchu Wrath of Heaven? Well, because Tenchu Wrath of Heaven is a soft reboot. It lifts specific elements, call them homages if you will, from the original Tenchu Stealth Assassins while maintaining the continuity of previous games. The homage comes in a number of forms, whether it's the fact your first mission is executing a corrupt minister at his home, some big demonic bad guy after mystical artifacts to rule over the land, party crashing, Onikage. You get the picture. Clearly, Wrath of Heaven has done its homework, but is homage enough itself to make a game compelling? Let's start with the high-level takeaway. Tenchu Wrath of Heaven is like an overbooked flight on Christmas Eve. It's carrying a lot of baggage. Movement is the best it's ever felt. 60 FPS, finally migrating from tank controls. Moving around the environment feels fluid and satisfying. Pair this with some of the best level design in the series. It makes stealthing your way through moonlit estates, Ronin villages, and ancient temples genuinely interesting and challenging. Wrath of Heaven exchanges the sandbox in Birth of the Stealth Assassins for a more curated linear experience, for the better. But it's not all sunshine and shurikens. That reskin skeleton had some bone deficiencies that were never quite righted. Combat, while much improved, still retains issues around attack range, often making boss fights a particular chore that come to rely heavily on item use once again. The inclusion of ninja skills, while a great idea, falters in its execution due to an overemphasis on combat or moves with little utility. Finally, Wrath of Heaven's story is also another example of a missed opportunity, wasting the game's awesome character designs and narrative potential due to a lack of care and attention. Ultimately, it's a game with fantastic highs but infuriating lows that skirts greatness yet was still able to scratch that stealth action itch very few games could. But for now, let's head back to the beginning. There's no understating how much of a phenomenon the PlayStation 2 was. I still remember getting mine, somehow, for Christmas of its release year. Pretty fortunate. Originally, in Europe at least, the console was bundled with a demo disc featuring games like SSX Snowboarding, Ridge Racer 5, and DOA 2. I remember being blown away looking at the snow effects on SSX Snowboarding after having played Cool Borders on the PS1. On New Year's Day, I'd basically marched my dad off to buy a Tekken Tag tournament and then spent hours on end bowling with Kuma. Aside from bears knocking down pins, that console generation was a breeding ground for a lot of genre-defining and genre-creating games. Stealth games even had their time in the shadows too. Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, Splinter Cell, though an original Xbox game, the Hitman series, Sly Raccoon. There were a number of platinum-selling games released over the generation's life cycle that all had a unique take on the genre. Not only that, but ninjas had quite the resurgence. Shinobido from Acquire, Red Ninja, Shinobi, Ninja Gaiden, we were eating good. Though for Tenchu Wrath of Heaven, the jump to a new console brought with it a new developer. During the later stages of Tenchu Birth of the Stealth Assassins production, the Tenchu IP transferred to Activision. Despite Acquire studio head Endo's efforts to purchase the rights, the asking price was simply too high. Instead, the newly formed K2 Studios based in Osaka would lead Wrath of Heaven's development, with Activision holding the worldwide publishing rights and From Software, yes, that From Software, handling the Japanese release. Trying to find information on K2 and the entire development process for Wrath of Heaven was extremely difficult. Most of the developer interviews of the time can be found within the pages of old Famitsu and Dengeki magazines. At the turn of the millennium, games journalism had yet to make the full transition to the web, particularly in Japan, so unfortunately, a lot has been lost to time. That's not to say everything's lost if you're willing to look hard enough. K2 was founded in 2000 in Osaka, Japan by Mitsuo Kodama and Masanori Kawasashi. They primarily worked on Wrath of Heaven's PS2 and Xbox SKUs, as well as Kurenai. In 2008, they transitioned to come under the banner of Capcom, but before that, they worked on Tokimeki Memorial Girls' Side Second Kiss, so quite the pedigree. One development artifact remaining, preserved by Tenchu Checkpoint, was the making of documentary. It's revealed that development of the game coincided with that of the release of Birth of the Stealth Assassins. We get to hear from Activision producer Tadayuki Horie, who discusses their goal of creating a ninja game able to capture a global audience. Birth of the Stealth Assassins sold about half of what the original Tenchu Stealth Assassins did, though I take his remark as less of a going as broad as possible, but more along the lines of refining what was often quite janky gameplay. If we glean information that development for Wrath of Heaven began around the release of Birth of the Stealth Assassins, August 2000, and Wrath of Heaven's release date of March 2003, then, after all was said and done, you've got a development timeline of a little over 2 years. Birth of the Stealth Assassins was turned around in 18 months. 2 years for what was back then a AAA game seems absurd by today's standards. I can only think of Dragon Age 2, which made compromises to reach that deadline, and maybe the likes of the Like a Dragon series, which deliberately produces their game in order to reduce dev time and costs. In the behind-the-scenes video, the game's director, Mitsuo Kodama, highlights the enormous pressure the Tenchu legacy brought to the project, coupled with the potential of quite harsh critique from die-hard fans. K2 and Activision wanted the player to embody the spirit of being a ninja, so continued iteration became the backbone of their work. From a development standpoint, Wrath of Heaven is a bigger game. There are over 60 unique character designs throughout, which is a far cry from the original. Not only that, with more polygons to play with, the time investment in creating characters, which I think they really nailed in the game, was time well spent. And it's Kodama we have to thank for leading the charge on designs. I especially like how Temurai's henchmen are also visually unique. In particular, Ganda, who reminds me of Tesshu from Ninja Scroll, and Taijima, who obviously pays homage to Unosuke from Kurosawa's Yojimbo. When it came to the music for Wrath of Heaven, Noriyuki Asakura returned once again. While he described his musical direction for the first 2 games as expansive and then mellow respectively, his focus for Wrath of Heaven was the sense of melancholy in unrewarded courage, as he puts it. For the theme song this time around, Hausa was replaced by Japanese in order to give the song a wider appeal. While the title track Sadame, which translates to Fate or Destiny, is an absolute banger, I don't know whether mandating it to be in Japanese would have altered its popularity. What all the work culminated in this time around was a much tighter and fluid stealth action experience that picks up 1 year after the events of Stealth Assassins. While we'll delve into the narrative and gameplay a little further on, the main thrust of the story is that Rikimaru has seemingly returned from the dead after sacrificing himself to allow Ayame and Princess Kiku to escape. Upon his return, a new threat has descended upon the realm in the form of Tenrai, a sorcerer who's intent on collecting the 3 jewels of power. It's our ninja's job to stop him and to plow through a bunch of enemies doing so. As for publishing rights, Activision would handle the worldwide publishing rights, while From Software would deal with publishing in the game's native Japan. I'm sure there are some people out there who were unaware of From Software's connection to the franchise. As a company, they seem quite fond of the IP, going so far as to develop Shadow Assault Tenchu for the Xbox 360 and the PSP port of Wrath of Heaven, in addition to the port of Kurenai. From Software has basically published every Tenchu game since Wrath of Heaven. From Software had even planned to revive the series. Miyazaki said that at one point Sekiro had been a successor. However, it obviously diverged along development. I remember being in the audience at E3 for the reveal of Sekiro, and my first thought, like a number of others at the time, was, they're doing Tenchu? That wasn't the case. Can't say I'm disappointed, seeing as though Sekiro is one of my favourite games, and over time other games have scratched that Tenchu itch. But back to Wrath of Heaven and its rather interesting promotional events and development tie-ins. A 2-part prequel manga penned by Seishi Kishimoto was published in the April and May issues of Monthly Shonen Gangan, titled Tenchu-san Zenpen, Tenchu 3 Part 1, and Tenchu-san Kohen, Tenchu 3 Part 2. Of course, this being the early 2000s, a website with a Flash player was mandatory. It serves as a real time capsule of the aesthetic of some websites during that period. Having dabbled in Macromedia Flash way back when those stick animations and Newgrounds were extremely popular, it was pretty nostalgic. You can scroll through the characters, weapons, and other media. I especially like how they call Onikage the most insane madman in the Tenchu series, occupying 2 levels of craziness right there. There are also little Easter eggs within the site for you to uncover, which is quite novel. To further amp up the excitement for the game, Activision also held a competition, the Tenchu Wrath of Heaven Real Ninja Film Contest. They brought aboard John Woo and Terrence Chang, action film royalty, to judge the finalists, who could win $5,000. Ultimately, Joshua Gorin of the University of Pennsylvania won the $15,000 grand prize for The Ninja Movie, while the popular vote winner was Lisa Pola of Florida State University for Wonawoo. And no, I have no idea what that means. Would have loved to have dug up those videos, but the website's busted and they have seemingly been scrubbed from the internet. Critically, Wrath of Heaven's review scores align closer to that of Birth of the Stealth Assassins, at least in the land of Metacritic, sitting at an overall 79 for the PS2 version. One critic, and I use that term loosely, from Maxim Ryan Boyce, gave the game 5 stars. As I read this, let's call it a succinct review, I couldn't help feeling it needed a Limp Bizkit track to accompany it. If you're the kind of guy who likes to chop his prey into sizzling before he gets a whiff of your bad man musk, then the ninjas of Tenchu Wrath of Heaven are right up your dojo. I'm not American. I had to Google what sizzling is. It's a streaky bacon, what we call it in England, alternative. I get that it fits with Maxim's shtick, I just don't think we should put the critical quality of a 120-word review on the same level as a more thought-out review. Like, say, for instance, Douglas C. Perry's review over IGN. There's no mention of a healthy bacon alternative there. As was the style at the time, and it didn't even escape the Maxim review, there's your standard MGS reference. Perry says that these guys don't miss a beat in delivering an all-encompassing, authentic ninja game. Overall, it's an extremely positive review that praises the character designs, stealth, and the versus mode, though highlights the shortcomings of enemy AI. On the other side of the coin, Chris Baker, in issue 67 of the official US PlayStation magazine, awarded the game 3 stars. He criticised the game's tendency for enemies to become quickly uninterested in pursuing the character, the lousy combat engine, and its half-hearted attempt at a story. Valid criticisms, all things considered. However, one point of contention is the constant comparisons to NGS. It's understandable. We haven't escaped it even now. Think of how every tough action game gets compared to From Software's games these days. I'd just say the topic around Tenchu required a little more nuance because Tenchu and MGS occupy not just different design philosophies, but budgets, so it often comes across as pretty glib. Development for Wrath of Heaven didn't stop with the original PlayStation release. Activision contracted TKO to build a mobile version of the game, while Digital Bridges handled the distribution. Back then, in an iPhone smartphoneless world, the best you could hope for was a Java version. With the advent of higher, and I use that term loosely, powered mobile devices, we saw a number of Java games released such as Oblivion, Assassin's Creed, and who could forget the seminal release of Shrek 2. We truly inhabit a blessed timeline. Obviously, you're not going to find the complexity of the original game condensed to a phone. Back then, at least, it doesn't look terrible. It reminds me a little of Batman Returns on the Master System for some reason. Stranger still, the mobile version was released nearly 2 years after the original release of Wrath of Heaven on the PS2. While the mobile game may be less well known, the eventual Xbox port of Wrath of Heaven, titled Return from Darkness, probably rings a few more sisters' bells. It released close to 1 year after the PlayStation 2 version and sported a number of enhancements. There's the addition of a training mode in the Ronin village, dragging bodies returned from Birth of the Stealth Assassins, additional cutscenes are there, you've got ninja mind control, which was awesome, Xbox Live online play, graphical improvements, new missions, and a bunch of smaller tweaks that I'm omitting for brevity. If capturing footage from my Xbox wasn't painful, I would have used that version instead of the PlayStation 2. However, I don't think it fundamentally alters what I have to say about the game, even though I did enjoy the changes, so unless specified, all the footage is from an emulated PlayStation 2 version of Wrath of Heaven. Finally, there was Ninja Katsugeki Tenchu-san Portable for the PSP, released in 2009, courtesy of From Software. This version of the game, which was a Japan exclusive, encompassed all the changes from Return from Darkness, save the multiplayer functionality. Again, while I could have technically played that version for a more rounded experience, there are graphical compromises and the lack of a second analog stick. Gameplay-wise, you're essentially getting the Return from Darkness functionality. However, one thing I never quite understood was how this PSP incarnation of Tenchu had no issues with the draw distance, but the next portable release, Time of the Assassins, suffered from them so heavily. Alright, that is enough setup, let's get into it. The last time we saw Rikimaru and Ayame, they had just defeated Lord Mayo in the heart of his underground lair. In response to his death, the cave began to crumble, forcing the two Azuma Ninja and the recently rescued Princess Kiku rushing out to find an exit. In a hail of rubble, their escape route became blocked. Rikimaru had handed off the Azuma clan's ancestral blade Izoyoi to Ayame so that he could sacrifice himself in order for the other two to survive. Our final shot of Stealth Assassins shows Izoyoi thrust into the ground, acting as the only memento of his actions. A year has passed since then, but Mayo's defeat didn't bring calm to the realm for long. Japan has once again slipped into a violent rebellion. In the chaos, Tenrai and his 6 Lords of Darkness are scheming to take control of the land and defeat any who would stand in their way. Of course, it's up to 2 Azuma Ninja and a doctor come hitman to stop them. Standard stuff. Along this journey, Rikimaru and Ayame will run into some familiar once-dead faces as they slowly put together the pieces about Tenrai's true nature and how it connects to the events of the previous game. But that's about as broad as we can get because Wrath of Heaven's an unreliable narrator. Depending on the character you choose, Tenchu's story can play out in up to 3 different ways. It even splits further than that to a degree. So with that in mind, as we follow each character's narrative thread, we'll explore just how different Wrath of Heaven plays out and if we can piece together a definitive story. But taking a step back from the plot fundamentally, Wrath of Heaven doesn't rock the boat with its design choices. Essentially, development effort was focused on polishing what was there: stealth, movement, enemies, to bring them kicking and screaming into a new millennium. So it's bye-bye to handling your ninja like an unruly shopping trolley, and hello to 60 FPS analog controls. Movement is much more fluid this time around too. You can actually put some faith in your character to act how you expect, rather than letting Kami-sama take the wheel every time you made a precarious jump or attempted to land an attack. Stealth, of course, makes a return with crouching, wall-hugging, assassinations, and more, while staple ninja tools like the grappling hook, shurikens, poison rice, and the blow dart, amongst a ton of others, provide a deadly, if not always useful, ninja arsenal. Levels are far more curated than Birth of the Stealth Assassins, staying closer to the design philosophy of the first game, with smaller, more handcrafted missions. Combat, while greatly improved, continues to be rather janky and frustrating at the best of times, but I'll take that over Birth of the Stealth Assassins any day of the week. But rather than talking about all that in the abstract, it's easier to just kick things off with the series' mascot, Rikimaru. Rikimaru's introduction is perhaps one of the strangest from a narrative confusion standpoint, not like I've just climbed out of my nephew's neck as in Sekiro. For those that aren't aware of the previous games, having our character stare at what looks like a swirling vortex and vomit, it's a portal, and then peace out to only jump off a waterfall may come across as a tad confusing. Don't get me wrong, Rikimaru reeling off the Kujiin, also known as the 9 hand seals, or for those more cultured out there, that thing you may have seen in Naruto, is decidedly badass, though it doesn't particularly give us any insight into Rikimaru. It does cultivate an air of mystery. For those aware of the recent past, we're left wondering how Rikimaru is alive. For new players, you're just left wondering. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. Though the land lulled itself into a sense of security, it proved fertile ground for corruption to plant its roots and bloom. As we did in Stealth Assassins, we are once again punishing an evil merchant, the son of Echigoya, Tokubei.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
This is obviously one of the most apparent callbacks or homages to the original game. In a way, it's K2 saying to its fans, "We get you." Whether Lord Goda knows about Rikimaru's involvement in the mission, I can't say, but Tokubei has been conspiring with Goda's statesman Nasu in order to lure vulnerable villagers into their loan sharking ring, only to steal their daughters when the debtor was unable to pay. We must punish the evil merchant. As it was with previous entries, you can choose your loadout before hopping into a mission, though at this point in the game, your arsenal's looking a little paltry to say the least. You can scavenge items while on your mission if you poke around, there's always at least one ninja rebirth item, and earn more by completing missions with a high rank or attaining a Grandmaster ranking. We get another callback to the OG in the design of the shed itself, so no longer are we confined to the black mass of Birth of the Stealth Assassins. But one mechanic that didn't carry over was the ability to locate unique items within the levels themselves for the most part. There are a couple of special ones out there which we'll get to later. There's an often bandied around adage in game design attributed to John Romero. It concerns creating your first level last because you've become so familiar with your game's mechanics and moment-to-moment gameplay that you're now best equipped to tutorialize them. However, depending on how your team handles development, you may not have the luxury of designing your first levels last. So, oftentimes, your first levels are the recipients of the most care and attention during development. If you've ever played a game and kind of felt the quality drop off in the third act, it may often be the case that levels were, for the most part, delivered quite linearly. Baldur's Gate 3 comes to mind. It got a bit of flack for Act 3, and with early access being so focused around the first act of the game, you can understand that eats into development. So what's that got to do with Punish the Evil Merchant? Well, Punish the Evil Merchant introduces a number of interesting level concepts and design touches that unfortunately don't continue through the rest of the game. When you first drop into the area, you'll now find it feels a lot better navigating your ninja around the space. Having come directly from capturing footage from Birth of the Stealth Assassins, the difference is night and day. And on that note, missions are now totally set during the night, which goes a long way in capturing that aesthetic. If you're familiar with Stealth Assassins, the current track playing may also ring a bell. It's a remixed version of the original Punish the Evil Merchant piece. Here they are, side by side. As we did in Stealth Assassins, you begin outside of Echigo's estate. In this preliminary area, Wrath of Heaven imparts a few mechanics. Obviously, you've got the first guard simply milling about in a large open space, giving you an easy opportunity for a stealth kill. Along one of the Kura's, Japanese storehouse's eaves, there's a beehive. You can lob a shuriken at this, and if you time it right, it'll land on or around a guard, distracting them. An interesting mechanic, but you seldom find it anywhere else in the game. Along the outskirts of the area, you can locate a ninja rebirth item by the waterway, as well as in the Kura itself. Your ultimate destination is to proceed to the inner area of the estate, and there are a couple of ways to accomplish this. The game displays a short cutscene as you approach a bunch of guards having a good time sipping sake. There's a key precariously close to them. This key unlocks a gate to the Yakutabori, or Yagurabori, which is an underground waterway used to supply water, drainage, and even defense for estates. Obtaining this key is fairly trivial. You simply have to crouch from the right side and slowly approach it to yoink it. If you choose this method, there are more guards to contend with. They not only guard the entrance, but the tunnel itself. If you poke around, there's an alternative method of infiltration, a secret crawl space connecting the inner and outer estate. Your ninja can take this path and crawl on their hands and knees for a good old distance before emerging in an opposite Kura in the heart of the estate. This area serves as a more direct throwback to Stealth Assassins. The collection of 4 Kura and a Nihon Teien, which is a traditional Japanese garden, conjure memories of those same features in Punish the Evil Merchant. There are a couple of goodies to pick up here, and as you've been stealth killing guards, you may have even pilfered some of their weapons. You can enhance your arsenal with weapons like the bow and spear, though honestly, while a novel idea, I never found them particularly useful. Continuing onwards, you'll find the estate's largest building. There are a number of guards milling around the perimeter, but you can easily avoid them all by sticking to the walls, skirting the compound, and slinking in through another opening. The same approach you could take in the original mission. If you've been playing more assassin than ninja so far, chances are you will have filled up the Kujin meter. Each stealth kill will charge 1 kanji, while a normal kill often fills it by around half. Upon successfully filling the gorge, you'll be rewarded with a new ninja technique, We'll tackle these when we come to them, but the first technique you receive is the shoulder thrust. I love this move because it's often hilarious to jettison guards off a platform and into a bottomless pit for a quick kill. During boss battles, it provides you with some breathing room to chug a potion or line up an attacking item, like the explosive arrow. However, not all techniques have this utility, unfortunately. Newly acquired technique in hand, we've now transitioned into the building itself. I love this change in setting the first time through the game. The interior is deceptively large and complex, but one of the issues the game has with interior locations, especially those with shoji sliding doors, is that you can't crouch by them to peek through, like you could do in successive games. It can often lead to a situation where you come face to face with a guard in an awkward situation. Alternatively, you can enter the building by the front door itself, which obviously has more guards lying in wait. However, the difficulty isn't particularly ramped up. Regardless, navigating this contracted area is a ton of fun. You really have to keep an eye on your key meter as you essentially proceed downwards in order to go upwards. About halfway through, you'll encounter your first boss, Taijima. As I mentioned earlier, this dude is ripped straight from Yojimbo. His character design is awesome, as is his moveset, though he can be pretty slow in the versus mode. His special move of knocking an enemy into the air and juggling them with his pistol is sick. His status is only elevated through his delivery of Sasaki's Echigo Senior's former bodyguard's line.
Looks like you chose the wrong party to crash.
Battling Taijima here is a bit of a pain because of the tight quarters. If nothing else, it's teaching you to use the lock-on ability to strafe around an enemy and time your attacks. Oh, and good luck acquainting yourself with the game's mechanics if you're a newcomer. I always forget because I'm generally familiar with the series, but the only form of tutorial is text-based and pretty awful. While I did remedy this in Return from Darkness, it's a glaring oversight that could have only manifested because of time constraints. One other little cultural tidbit is the hijikaki, literally elbow rest, that you can see dot some of the floors. If you've ever watched an anime, show or film, you'll often see a dude or dudette resting their elbows on this in an attempt to look nonchalant. With Taijima dead, how did he even know we were there? Rikimaru continues through the house. Along with the tight corridors, you may also spot a famous ukiyo-e by Shiraku Toshusai, Otani Onji III in the role of the servant Edobe. This style of painting was extremely popular during the 17th and 19th century. Tenchu may skirt this time period, however this particular painting is from 1794, so it's law-breaking and therefore the whole game's world building crumbles. This section of the mission does a good job of creating more complex area design with very little real estate. There are paths to crawl under, some tighter guard positions, a cat who isn't fond of you. It's a clear showcase of a level that had enough time to cook. After climbing through the attic to assassinate a few Ronin guards, it's finally time to drop in on Nasu's little party. Rikimaru gets felt up by Nasu before the statesman finally deduces this chick is a little more ripped than he thought. Turns out his party trick is dispensing divine punishment. Tokubei isn't keen to stick around, so he gives it the old Irish goodbye by dipping it out. However, Nasu doesn't want to tangle with Rikimaru one-on-one, so enlists a couple of his guards to help him. Though technically not as enclosed as our duel with Taijima, you'll often find yourself ganged up on. Let's hope that you found some bombs along the way or stocked up on health potions. Enemy damage has been greatly toned down compared to the previous games, so you can afford to make some mistakes. If this is your first time playing the game and purposely avoided being detected, it may prove quite a challenge. If you focus down the guards and then move on to Nasu himself, it shouldn't be too much trouble. When Nasu's been taken care of, Rikimaru focuses his attention on Tokubei. Echigo's son is in a much more talkative mood, all too willing to spill the name of a conspirator within Goda's ranks, Hamada. Supposedly, this was all his doing, but before Rikimaru is able to extract any further information, something pierces the shoji and stains it red with Tokubei's blood. This causes a temporal rift, but we'll get to that. Rikimaru rushes outside to find none other than Onikage in his signature state of elevation. I can only assume he has a very long foot to be able to both kill Tokubei and then flip up onto the wall. Posed in front of the full moon, it paints quite a striking picture for the demon's return, whose new look has quite a sad Hanya mask vibe to it. Usually one to glow any chance he gets, Onikage instead silently hops off into the night. We're then treated to a foreboding scene with a few flaming balls discussing Rikimaru's victory over Lord Mayo, and Ayame doesn't even get a shout out. We'll come to understand just who those mysterious voices are soon enough. But after the mission's complete, we're greeted with a familiar scene, the mission results screen. You get 20 points per stealth kill, 5 per normal kill, and a 450 point bonus if you're not spotted. If you are spotted, then it takes away 150 from that 450 total, and then 30 points for each successive time you're found. If you kill an innocent, that's 50 points deducted. Attaining Grandmaster is a lot more lenient than in Birth of the Stealth Assassins, aligning itself more with Stealth Assassins, with the point threshold sitting at 450. Simply completing the level unseen without killing a soul will net you the ranking, and the item that comes with it, the Super Shuriken, which fires off a span of 8 Shuriken. The item you receive for the ranking differs depending on the characters you've chosen, which is a nice change too. With Echigoya Jr.'s words still fresh in Rikimaru's mind, he returns to Goda's castle in order to ferret out the traitorous Hamada. However, with Rikimaru supposedly dead, none of Goda's guards know of his existence. If they spot us, they'll stab on sight. This results in the first half of the mission being pure stealth as we race to locate Hamada. We begin in the rafters of Goda Castle. For a new player, it may feel quite daunting to have to navigate this tight, sometimes confusing interior space. However, the guards' patrols aren't too inscrutable, and your map is a big help in your search. In fact, if you had a disguise or invisibility, which you gain from later missions, you can breeze through this part in record time. Once you've located Hamada, Rikimaru's quick to dispense justice, judge, jury, and executioner style. No sooner has Hamada's corpse begun to grow cold, we get some ninja gatecrashers. Our mission now is to reach Lord Goda before it's too late. With his guards now assumedly dead, you can technically dispense with any notion of stealth, but it's best to keep it up if you want to fill your Kujin meter and unlock the next skill. There are a couple of ways to navigate the castle, but you essentially want to head upwards. This incarnation of Goda Castle is much tighter and more intricate than the last time we saw it ablaze in Birth of the Stealth Assassins. Gone are the large hallways, replaced by small rooms and constricting pathways. It's a much improved location for it, forcing you to be more conservative with timing your kills lest you alert an enemy on an intersecting patrol route. You can take advantage of a few secret pathways, namely the one in the room you assassinated Hamada, as well as hop out onto the roof at one section and wend your way around the castle. There's even a Nakaniwa interior garden, which some may remember from Execute the Corrupt Minister in Stealth Assassins. Here you can sneak under the floorboards to dodge some guards and yoink an item. These little flourishes here and there really help elevate the level. If you've managed to fill your Kujin meter, you'll be rewarded with the ninjutsu block technique. Essentially, it's a parry that can throw off the enemy guard if your timing is correct. More often than not, I end up pulling this off by mistake when trying to block. It's kind of useful if you get used to enemy attack patterns, but you're better off keeping your distance and dodging attacks most of the time. When you've reached your destination, a pretty striking gold-lit floor, Rikimaru reintroduces himself to Lord Goda and Sekia. However, Ayame's also been keeping watch over the castle and finds Rikimaru's timing rather convenient. He claims that he sent his shadow across the land while he slept. Technically, this is true, but I believe Rikimaru's not being 100% truthful. It'll become apparent later why that's the case. With that, our mission here is complete, and for Grand Mastering the stage, you'll receive the ever-useful Exploding Arrow, which is great against bosses. A particular fond memory of this item was when in Versus mode, using it to catapult your opponent clean across the stage. From the surprise attack on the castle, the Azuma deduce it was an attempt to stop Rikimaru from reaching Goda. However, contrary to their plans, the crystal residue on the ninja's clothes could be traced back to the limestone caverns. It's here that Lord Mayo's sword is said to reside, drawing malevolent powers. Now, this location is an interesting one from a lore perspective. I believe it's the same location where Rikimaru began the game before hopping off the waterfall, and was the location of Mayo's underground lair from the first game. Typically, during that period, limestone was often used in construction of castles and temples. When we arrive, there's a hidden ninja rebirth item behind where we start, a common theme in the game. Our mission is to navigate the cavern and locate the Shishisto's sword. There's a guard right outside the cave opening, though he's easily dealt with. The two dudes patrolling the limestone cavern entrance are genuinely difficult to stealth kill without the use of items. Splashing about in the water will attract their attention, so you're forced to roll towards them. Not only that, but one of them can spy you from atop the little guard tower too. The level is quite an uptick in difficulty, in a good way. As you press further into the caverns, you're also met with a couple of ninja alongside some tracks. Again, it's situations like this which are very reminiscent of the first game and ask a player those difficult questions. I believe the ninja also have quite decent vision range, which makes instances in the cavern where your only way is going forward rather challenging. While the area itself starts off as quite linear, it's soon transformed into a bunch of winding paths with alternate ways to proceed, both upwards and downwards. We're also introduced to a new enemy type here, shown in red. These guys are clearly demons, so if a resurrected Onikage and Talking Flames didn't tip you off to some sorcerer's involvement, you should be well aware now. These guys were a ton of fun in the multiplayer because their special move was an assassination you could just stun lock people with. The special move you receive here is the Ninja Eye ability, which functions like a monocular to zoom in. Honestly, it has very little utility outside of pairing it with the blow dart to get some Olympic level archery shots on foes. There's rarely a time that you need to look so far into the distance because, to the game's credit, areas are smaller and the environment has decent visual telegraphs. The game stays true to the alternate pathways in this mission as well, maybe even to its detriment, but there's a ton of verticality and you can even skirt around the exterior of the cave at one point, presumably to the ocean that Rikimaru took a dip in earlier. Bottomless pits and platforming also make a prominent return here. Thankfully, navigating your character this time around lets you have confidence in how they'll move in the environment, but it's still easy to get caught out and mistime a jump. When you've finally reached the heart of the cave, Rikimaru finds the Shishisto's sword hidden behind a rock wall. Revealing it appears to trigger some kind of portal to manifest, along with our old rival Onikage. This is the first time we hear the name Tenrai mentioned, who was responsible for Onikage's resurrection. Tenrai tasked him with finding the sword in order to open a portal to revive Meo. That's all the motivation either of them need to come to blows. The brawl with Onikage comes in two parts. The first sees him with considerably less health and less aggressive AI. He's still a fan of the fancy footwork and has an awesome moveset. The attack where he basically anchors his foot into an opponent's shoulder and then backflip kicks them in the jaw is so extra. However, even if you defeat Onikage, it was but a shadow. The real Onikage reveals himself and stealth kills Rikimaru. I much prefer Onikage's second design, with the ancient seals wrapped around his body. Paired with his wan skin and red eyes, it really leans into the fact he's more demon now than he ever was. Onikage calls out to Rikimaru, but there's no answer. With the Shishisto sword in hand, he attempts to summon Meo. However, someone else answers the call. After the badass cutscene, it's a true face-off between the true versions of Rikimaru and Onikage. Obviously, Rikimaru wasn't being entirely truthful speaking to Ayame earlier, having been trapped in a portal and all. We were actually controlling his shadow. There is, I believe, a slight difference in defense and attack power between these two versions of Rikimaru, which is a nice touch. The battle will be the toughest you've had so far. Onikage is quick and has some powerful moves. He, of course, can chug a health potion if his HP passes a certain threshold. You want to make use of your arsenal to focus him down as much as possible, keeping close to not give him a chance to attack. But when he's defeated, not killed mind you, because when is he ever, a couple of ninja appear to distract Rikimaru just after he's picked up the Shishisto sword. Of course, Onikage vows to kill you another day, but not before leaving Rikimaru with a parting gift over the same eye that Tatsumaru had previously scarred with Izoyoi. For completing this level with a Grand Master ranking, you're awarded the Chameleon spell, which will let you temporarily disguise yourself as the enemy. If you attack an enemy while disguised, you'll revert back, so it's best used for passing obstacles. If you want to go on a killing spree undetected, there is a much better item that becomes available later on.
If we weren't done with the callbacks to the previous game, it's time for...
You must rescue Princess Kiku.
That is 3 games in a row where Kiku's been kidnapped. How she has not suffered some extreme trauma from all this, how Goda's parenting hasn't been brought into question, how this keeps happening is insane. Surely some form of child protective services should have been called by now. Well, Kiku's trauma is evidently our gain because we get one of Wrath of Heaven's best levels in the Ronin village. This locale stands in our way to Amagai Castle, where Kiku is currently being held hostage. On a cold and rainy night, Rikimaru arrives in the village, observed from upon high by an agent of Tenrai donning a Sugigasa, or an Amigasa, those cool straw hats. The Ronin village is split into 4 distinct parts, and there's a few ways you can tackle progression through each section. The first area consists of a few huts and buildings patrolled by guards, Ronin, and a dog. You can take the stealth approach via the rooftop to skirt past the guards, or even roll through the canals to cut a path over to the opposite end of where you begin. But there's a lot of fun to be had by just scything through enemies. The first 2 guards also have a pretty humorous conversation about their feet if you allow them to talk before stealthing them. Due to the tight nature of this area, going in for stealth kills can be a risk, because there's a high chance that you'll either be spotted while performing the assassination, or the guard will soon discover the corpse. with no way to drag bodies until Return from Darkness. It's a cool example of one of my favourite stealth game mechanics. Not as prevalent in Tenchu, it's more of a factor in games like Shadow Tactics, where you have not only to think about the enemy you're about to off, but also what sort of chain reaction that can cause. It often leads you to following a thread of enemies back to their nexus, where that specific kill then leads you to be able to kill guards several lines of sight later. Once you've had your fun here, you'll crawl through a drainage opening in the cliffside to emerge in a shallow canal. There's a dog roaming around here, and their general inclusion in the game is a welcome return and sorely missed in the prequel. As I said in that review, an enemy not easily dispatched, unless you have shurikens, forces you to change up your plan of attack. What's cool about this area is that the walled off section is totally optional, and therein lies the challenge. With 2 enemies often upon a raised platform, a special item on a small altar, and a guard patrolling the ground, it's up to you to weigh up if it's worth it or not. I mean, the red box could be anything. I always engage with this portion even if I mess up, because it's an extra bit of challenge to overcome, even if the reward isn't particularly worth it. If you've been diligently assassinating enemies so far, you'll be well on your way to collecting your next ninja technique, the grappling hook combo. Anecdotally, I could never pull this move off consistently. Essentially, it can allow you to juggle enemies. However, the nature of it highlights an issue with many of the combat-focused ninja techniques. They don't work on bosses, and you don't really want to be picking a protracted fight with every guard you come across. Venturing a little further, just before exiting this area, you'll come to a building with 2 large barrels in front of it. Ever wondered what was inside these barrels? Sake, or fermenting rice and other ingredients to eventually become sake. If you've ever been somewhere like a temple in Japan, or just other places in general, you may have seen smaller, more colourful versions of these barrels. Their designs are often really quite striking. However, as a ninja, we're not interested in the barrels for their ability to create alcohol, more so their ability to give us a decent vantage point. This is especially true in the next area. The best way to make it through this section is to utilize these barrels and be extremely cautious when you time your kills. Even though it's a restrained area, the verticality paired with enemy patrols help elevate it into a little puzzle of sorts. What's also worth mentioning on this level is the soundtrack. The melange of genres still persists in Tenchu's soundtrack, though not to the extent of Stealth Assassins. This track has always given me Wild West vibes due to the guitar. The mixture of woodwind instruments and strings lend it that Japanese feeling too, because you can draw a lot of parallels between the perception and aesthetics of Ronin and gunslingers. It's why Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars transferred so well. Once we're finished here, taking the door may seem like the only exit out of this area. However, you'd be wrong. You can in fact crouch by the little drainage area and crawl through in order to reappear in a sewer closer to the northeast side of the next area. If you take the doors, you'll find yourself at the uppermost part of the village's final section. Again, it's a simple area, but the combination of buildings to sneak along and patrols just make tearing through this area a ton of fun. It has some similar vibes to Deliver the Secret Message from Stealth Assassins, but with more nuance and better design intent. Your reward for grandmastering this level is the Semimaru dog bone. As it was in Stealth Assassins, using this will summon the Azuma clan's dog to harass enemies. I'd say it has more utility in this game rather than the original because it can draw aggro, which is helpful against some bosses because they have a greater range of attack. However, you'd need to be aware of this before heading into a mission because you're still sacrificing a precious item slot. Amagai Castle. This and the level that precedes it are probably my most disliked in Wrath of Heaven for different reasons. If you thought Goda's Castle or the Limestone Cavern had the potential to be confusing, your first time through this place can be worse. I admire the mission's intention. It's supposed to be confusing. That's the kind of guy that Chimera, the Mad Lord of this castle, is. Things start simple enough in the basement of the castle, where you're introduced to the wooden automatons that act as guardians. On the one hand, they're visually interesting, especially the deadly Chibok creature. Normally, guards can be assassinated, but the wooden younglings have to simply be slashed. These little dudes are pretty hilarious. In the making of documentary, the team expressed their joy at creating this enemy because it's just so visually interesting, not to mention the array of unpredictable and deadly attacks it sports. In multiplayer, it's kinda like Oddjob from GoldenEye, in that it's quite difficult to hit. The enemy also has a pretty hilarious special move where it will just eject a payload of bombs at you. Conceptually, Amagai Castle reminds me of Tick-Tock Clock from Mario 64. You're basically navigating one large interconnected series of cogs. Traps are everywhere. Some will plunge spears into your head, others will eject explosive bombs and smoke, the floor will give way underfoot. It's as if this entire castle is as sentient as its guards and they're all out to kill you. As you navigate the floors, you're constantly on the lookout for areas to grapple up to, holes to fall down, and secret walls that lead to new areas. While not as cramped as Goda Castle, it's no less strict with some of your timings, often lulling you into a false sense of security. If the path to a guard looks clear, that doesn't mean a trap isn't waiting to trip you up. Repeated playthroughs of Amagai Castle do help alleviate the confusion, but it's still funny when I forget there's a trap room which will firstly lob smoke bombs at you, then, while you're busy coughing up a lung, here comes the explosives. If you've ever played a section of a game where you can feel the devs are going out of their way to be a bit of a dick to the player, this is it. Don't get me wrong, it's equal parts frustrating and hilarious. Though the enemy numbers can be quite tight in Amagai Castle, it is possible to unlock a new ninja technique, Cling to Ceiling. In principle, it's one of my favourite techniques. You aim your hook at the ceiling, zip up, and then hold R1 to sucker yourself to it. From here, you can drop a rice ball to lower a guard, or simply wait for an unsuspecting enemy to wander under you like a human spider. A Spider-Man, if you will. My issue with the move is that you have to go out of your way to be cool and use this. Oftentimes, if you're in a situation where you can use this move, it's simpler to just go and assassinate the enemy. In my mind, the cool way is something I shouldn't have to go more out of my way to perform. It should be either the same amount of effort or less. I still use it to be flashy, don't get me wrong. I just think it could have been further refined by allowing you more leeway in how directly you need to be under the portion of ceiling that you wish to cling to, or include specific situations where this method was more viable. As you make your way through Amagai Castle, traps become deadlier and more frequent. One particular instance has you trying to hop over an explosive floor, which then has the goal to launch a flaming arrow just when you think you're safe. Beyond that, you reach the cog room. I have no idea what these cogs power, I assume all the traps, but you're tasked with navigating through this portion and across a set of deadly guillotines to boot. It's a prime example of a mission where you need to stock up on healing potions, not just for the boss, but in case you get baited by the dozens of dangerous traps along the way. If and when you somehow make it to the end of the level, you'll come face to both Dollface with Dr. Kimura and Mahime, his Ningyo puppet.
What the hell?
Kiku's busy being kidnapped, so it's up to Rikimaru to defeat the Doctor. The battle is a real pain. Mahime can fire a round of unblockable bullets that you're forced to dodge. There's also this spin attack that can be a little janky with the block. I'm not sure if the game wants you to perfect block the attack. The best weapon against Kimura is the exploding arrow, if you've unlocked it. Trying to use bombs is literally hit or miss, because thanks to Mahime, he can get around the arena pretty swiftly. Once defeated, Kimura, of course, explodes. But with Kiku rescued, Ayame also appears at Amagai Castle. Little late, but never mind. Rikimaru hands Kiku to her because he's got to pay Resai, a swordsmith, a visit. It seems that in the battle with Kimura, Izoyoi scored a chip from all that blocking. We're then treated to a scene with Tenrai, who's just chilling in his black void, surrounded by talking candles, ruminating on Kimura's recent demise. For our troubles at the castle, we gain the invisibility spell, outright one of the best items in the game. Unlike the chameleon spell, which will wear off after a kill, the invisibility spell simply persists for a set amount of time. What you do with this time is up to you. Assassinate, dodge guards, doesn't matter. It's basically the I'm you, but better. Like all sensible weaponsmiths, Resai has set up his shop in a graveyard. Upon conferring with him, he gives us two ways to repair Izoyoi. We can use the steel that Resai has on hand, or we can utilize whatever amalgamation of mystic steel was used to forge the Shishisto sword. Unbeknownst to you, the repercussions of your choice only become apparent at the game's climax. Unfortunately for us, we can't just put up our feet while Resai gets to work. Not only must we retrieve the steel to fix the sword, regardless of which method you choose, but Tenrai has sicked hordes of undead on us. But how are we supposed to defeat these zombies and spirits and Manji Oh Mai without a blade? Resai's kind enough to hand over the Muramasa, a legendary blade that has the ability to drain life force, whether that be dead or undead, from whatever it cuts and transfer it to the wielder. And this is where the fun begins. At first, our situation appears tenable. We can test out the blade on a Manji dude just shuffling about. But while I'm glad these little weird things made a return, their moveset is super annoying. In the original Stealth Assassins, they could breathe fire but were quite slow. Those 2 points still hold true, but now the Manji have the ability to go ham with a series of rapid attacks. One-on-one, not a problem, but that won't hold true for much longer. The first half of this level sees you traversing a kind of catacomb cum mine area. You'll encounter a number of desiccated undead armed with swords and bows, flies buzzing around their decomposing heads. On the whole, The enemy design in the game is excellent, and these guys shake things up from slicing up ninjas. However, as soon as we exit this little tunnel, Wrath of Heaven transforms into Dead Rising. The dead have arrived, and they are not happy. For the next several minutes, with only the Muramasa, you have to keep hordes of undead at bay. Items do not work on them. There is no escape. If you allow it, they will continually gang up on you and absolutely fold you. I hated this part of the game back when I first played it, and I still hate it to this day. Muramasa has the ability to steal life, and that means your life too. It's a thirsty boy. So you're not only dealing with your health trickling down, but you're incurring damage from attacks along the way. The bowmen and to a lesser extent swordsmen aren't too much of an issue. It's when you throw in the manji and their fiery breath into the mix. If you get cornered, they will spam the move. You are effectively stun locked. It's here where the combat displays its limitations. Like in Birth of the Stealth Assassins, I still feel like there needs to be more range to your weapon. Maybe it's just me, but I'm always thinking my blade has more reach than it does, so your first slash ends up being short, or you'll hit an enemy and then your second slash misses its target. I suppose I can be thankful that this trial is close to the beginning of the level instead of at the end, and I do enjoy the different dimension the Muramasa adds to the stage and the level's layout. I just think they could have toned it down somewhat. Honestly, you're best just stocking up on health potions and maybe toss a prayer to the shrine while you're at it. But if you do make it past this gauntlet, the rest of the levels got a lot working for it. You briefly burrow underground once more to find undead soldiers in some challenging patrol routes. Interestingly enough, the sound or death knell of these zombies is actually I'm dying, just slowed down and altered, which is kinda strange since they're already technically dead. From here, you approach a small hilly area with a number of scattered enemies. Now that your items are effectively useless on the majority of opponents, you're forced into planning out your route with more care. In terms of enemy placement for Rikimaru's story, this mission is perhaps the most challenging, and it achieves this by having claustrophobic arenas for you to navigate. Managing to rack up enough kills will earn you the Feigned Death Ninjutsu, the most useless skill in the game. Technically, you can commit seppuku in order to draw an enemy towards you and then kill them. However, your health will slowly drain. I'm struggling to think of an instance where this move would be preferable to chucking a poison rice ball. You'd especially not want to use it in this mission because Muramasa would be going to town on your energy. Things get decidedly trippier the further into the graveyard we progress. These ghastly floating spirit heads really caught me off guard the first time I saw them. They are a little similar to the Nukikubi in Japanese folklore. Nuke, or Nukeru, has a few definitions, but in this instance, when paired with Kubi, which can be the head or neck depending on the context, basically means head detaching. However, rather than a spirit, Nukikubi was more like a curse. When a person slept, their head would detach from their body and float around. Bit of an inconvenience, but without really digging into Japanese ghost folklore, which there is an absolute ton of, I can't really pin down this enemy's origin. All I can say is that it's often a pain to kill, or re-kill. Pressing on, it's as if you're slowly descending further into hell. The clean walls from before become stained with blood, and you're often up to your ankles in the red stuff as you delve deeper. Though you may not have noticed it in the time playing this level, each time you enter a new area, a metal door slides down to block your path. These gates are numbered. I believe this functions as a play on both the Sanzu no Kawa, which is kinda like the River Styx from Greek mythology, a boundary between the living world and the dead that one must cross. I also get the feeling it mixes some of the Buddhist Dharma wheel, and the numbers depict the trials that you're enduring to reach the other side, freedom. It's a really subtle detail added to this mission that you won't catch unless you're looking for it. Of course, this being a graveyard and all, there are many other cultural flourishes to find. There are Ishidoro, the stone lanterns, Shide, which is the folded paper, and the Waraningyo. These little straw dolls can symbolize both voodoo and protection. The ones situated in the graveyard here, I reckon, are for the former. There's a character we've yet to meet who possesses a particular set of mystical abilities. Thinking of these straw dolls as beacons to amplify their power and control these creatures fits with the lore and is a nice example of some environmental storytelling. But getting back on track and finishing off the level, Rikimaru is finally introduced to the game's big bad, Tenrai. He wishes for Rikimaru to join his side, but of course, our shadow would never go for that. Then, inexplicably, an old friend or foe appears, Tatsumaru. I have far too much to say about the inclusion of legacy characters, but we're not quite there yet. For now, let's just say this makes no sense. Not the Tatsumaru being a live part, but him appearing to guard Tenrai. We've already established this is just some form of astral projection, so why does Tatsumaru need to chuck down a smoke bomb so the two can vanish? Tenrai could literally just disappear without a thought. Ridiculous. That aside, your Grandmaster reward for this level is the fire spell. Having featured in all the games so far, it functions more like an AoE blast in this incarnation. I suppose it has more utility than its previous appearance, in that it was always quite slow to execute and you basically had to be standing right next to your target. Still, its utility is obviously dwarfed by the good old flaming arrow. The intro scroll for this mission tells you all you need to know about how Wrath of Heaven approaches its narrative, in that you are reminded who Ayame is, your fellow Azuma ninja. She's been locked up by Goda after attacking him, though claims it was an imposter who did so. Breaking a ninja out of prison is a big no-no and goes against the code, so the only way to resolve the situation is for you to hunt down this imposter within the bamboo forest. Couple of things to point out here. Number one is that while the rule does exist in the game's lore anyway, it was broken in Stealth Assassins upon Goda's say-so. This was in Stealth Assassins Rescue the Captive Ninja mission, if you can believe it. Number two is that after all Ayame and by extension the Azuma Ninja have done for Goda, the guy really should be giving them the benefit of the doubt. In a world with shadow clones, mysticism, portals to other dimensions, you're telling me Goda couldn't even entertain the fact she was telling the truth? Come on. If there was a line about his council basically forcing his hand to do this, or even better a cutscene, it'd be more believable. In its current state, it's just sloppy. But hey, we get a decent level out of it, so there's that. I've said it before and I'll say it again, you can't go wrong with either snow or a bamboo forest in a ninja game. This one is a much bigger upgrade in pretty much every aspect, from In Pursuit of Tatsumaru, from Birth of the Stealth Assassins, or Cross the Checkpoint from Stealth Assassins. In this area, you're introduced to two new enemies for Rikimaru. The first is Jonin Blue, who attacks with claws, similar to the enemy from the first game. He has a cool special move which essentially acts like a kamikaze into the enemy, which was also a lot of fun in the multiplayer. The second enemy is the Shikigami. These are conjured beings whose power is connected to and birthed from whomever has summoned them. Just like in the previous level, we'll find out soon enough who that sorcerer is. While these things can't be traditionally stealth killed, they can be regular killed. I think the devs missed a trick here. It would have been cool if the only way to dispatch them, much like the undead, was through wielding the Muramasa. In reality, you just slice them up. However, the game cautions you to avoid them entirely, which is a little misleading. The level itself has a lot of diversity in its small environment, usually containing a handful of enemies for you to either avoid or dispatch. We also see a return of a few different pathways for you to choose from, offering multiple ways to reach each successive section. You can even take a trip to an onsen if you feel like it. Just make sure you've brought some shurikens because there are wolves roaming the area too, so you're left with quite the variety in tackling threats. One component I wish they had leaned into further during this level was the actual bamboo aesthetic. It's mainly used to hem your character in within the boundary of the level, rather than utilized as an obstacle or tool to change up your stealth options. The level does make good on its enemy placement, especially with the wolves who have the ability to sense the player from a great distance. Oftentimes, you want to focus on getting these beasties out of the picture first and foremost. As you travel along the path, you'll also encounter a big old Yuki Daruma, a snowman just chilling. Your technique reward for this mission is the wall kick. Again, in theory, this is a cool looking move. You just leap towards a wall, hit attack, and you'll propel yourself towards the enemy. If they're unaware, it's a stealth kill. Again, it doesn't make anything easier, just cooler. If, say, there was an enemy placement below you just off to the side, and you had to leap forwards to a wall, then wall kick it, it could have been interesting as opposed to just luring them out. With all that said, when you've reached what I assume is a shrine, you'll find Ayame waiting for you. Kinda strange. We know that she's been locked up and the imposter fled to the forest. So did this person really think announcing themselves was the best idea? Rikimaru is able to see through the ruse because false Ayame used the word friend. Of course, an Azuma ninja would never use such a word. The fight is a real pain. Ayame is very quick and has the multiple shuriken item, which she'll use if you put any distance between the two of you. It's in these situations I really get frustrated with the lack of range on attacks. Even if you block and then go to retaliate, your sword simply whiffs past the enemy and then you're the one getting skewered. The only really viable option in most battles is to back your enemy into a corner and keep spamming attacks until they're dead. But when false Ayame is defeated, the imposter is revealed. He's not in an answering mood though, choosing to bite off his own tongue. The imposter's names, Hyakubake, is the kanji for 100, and bake, which being Japanese can mean a number of things like change, taking the form of something, In this context, I'd like to think it's closer to 100 faces or forms being able to essentially use the enemy disguise ninja item. With another boss down, Tenrai doesn't seem too disappointed, though he is quick to dispatch Kagura and the giant gander. So, you reckon these two will be waiting for us at the end of the next mission? For grandmastering the bamboo forest, you'll receive the ninja armor. Basically, this piece of equipment halves the damage you would normally take. While it's not needed for your run-of-the-mill jaunts through a level, it's always good to have for boss encounters. They can often catch you out with the damage they inflict, and wearing armor provides a bit more breathing room if you need to heal. Infiltrate the Buddha Temple is Rikimaru's penultimate mission. Though the final mission is technically 2 levels, which I suppose is tradition now, I always view that as a whole entity. We're treated to a little backstory surrounding the temple. Tenrai's army, first time hearing about them, has taken over the area, which also served as a fortress on the border of Goda's land. This was all part of Tenrai's plan. Keep the Azuma ninja distracted or banged up so that his forces could occupy the temple. I suppose that's kind of a compliment, but Goda cannot reclaim the temple because it's a holy ground and would also show martial vulnerability. I'm no historian, but I don't believe that attacking a temple was violating some spiritual law. While temples themselves could have been fortified and served as a stronghold of sorts, I think it's a pretty weak cop-out on Goda's side. It's shaky narrative ground that I think is more plausibly handled in Ayame's version of events. But at least we get a fun level out of it. The Buddha Temple is perhaps the most vertically inclined and labyrinthine mission so far. You'll find tons of little outcroppings to grapple up to, holes to crawl through, with a fair bit of platforming thrown in as well. I also love the enemy design here. Some of the monks wear tengai, those straw baskets on their heads. They are modelled on, or perhaps are, komuso, itinerant monks who often played the shakuhachi flute. The word komuso consists of 3 kanji, kyo, meaning void or emptiness, mu, meaning nothingness or non-existence, and so, meaning monk or priest. So you have priest of emptiness, though monk of the void sounds cool and like a Sekiro boss. The basket itself symbolizes their detachment from the world and humility. The funny thing about their flute here is that they'll use it to spit poison darts at you if you end up engaging them. When the intro crawl talked about Tenrai's army, I was expecting ninjas, not monks. So it kind of feels like we're just slaughtering the inhabitants of the temple rather than an opposing force. It would have been hilarious if that were Tenrai's actual plan, but that's giving the sorcerer far too much credit. The mission itself blends the architecture of the temple, stone walls and imposing red pillars, with winding caves that make it feel like scaffolding built into the mountain itself. There's a keen sense of scale as you're rushing past handfuls of squat pillars, reaching upwards several floors. Thanks to all the rafters, handholds, and bisected nature of the floors, you're given a ton of freedom in how you approach the pathing guards. Oftentimes, enemies can be found in little clusters, which gives you a reason to whip out your poison rice, blow dart, enemy disguises, or simply bide your time from the rafters or platform edge. For successfully filling your meter during the level, you'll be rewarded with the ninja mind control technique. It sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. If you use it on an unsuspecting guard, it'll stun them. If you perform the move when there is another enemy present, they'll turn on their comrade. And in the updated Return from Darkness, if no other enemies are around, the ensorcelled enemy will kill themselves. I think the move would have been much cooler if it were a 1 use per level technique from distance that basically worked like a poison dart for the insta-kill. As you delve deeper into the grounds, the natural geological features start to give way to the temple's architecture of man-made walls and wooden floorboards. If you spend some time exploring, you can pick up Rikimaru's unique sword, Gaku. It's capable of more raw damage than Izoyoi, but its attacks are much slower, so your mileage may vary with this one. Incapable of using the various moves you've learned in its combos, it's really not that much of an upgrade and just hoards an item slot. Navigating to the weapon can be a bit of a challenge, requiring you to hop between pillars and gaps, so good luck with that. Eventually, you'll grapple up through an opening to the temple grounds themselves. We have the welcome return of the bear, just wandering about, as well as a few guards. There are multiple ways to enter the temple, either via a second floor window at its front, or you can take out the bear and infiltrate the rear. Once inside, you may get a few flashbacks from Infiltrate the Manji cult, thanks to the large statue surrounded by scaffolding. Though I think the statue in that one lacked the foreboding glowing red eyes. As you're poking around and hopefully taking out guards, a cutscene kicks in. We are finally introduced to Gander, the giant who we only saw the back of previously, along with Kagura, the one responsible for raising the dead and conjuring those Shikigami in the bamboo forest. It's brief, like all the cutscenes to be honest, but Kagura is the recipient of the most badass line of the Game Award.
Gander, Show him what pain is, will you?
Just before blades are drawn, Kagura imbues Gander with several magical slips of scripture. It'll come into play in just a moment. The battle can be quite tough. It all depends on how you approach it. As a 2-on-1, you're clearly outnumbered. Gander loves to chase you around, sweeping with his staff or scooping you up into his tree trunk-like arms. As you can imagine, he has a ton of HP. Kagura likes to hand back and annoy you. She'll happily throw out seals to damage you, and if you approach, will either block your attacks or teleport away. However, she has a much smaller health pool. The most efficient way of dealing with this fight is by taking out Kagura, though that's easier said than done. If you have the glorious exploding arrow, it'll end the fight quickly. If you're relying on good old Izayoi, it may take a while. What makes things worse is that if you didn't dispatch some of the monks within the temple, they'll get in on the party too. You can make use of the rafters above to give yourself a breather. It would have been awesome if you were able to stay hidden long enough to get a stealth kill on one of them. It reminds me of the corrupted monk from Sekiro that you duel with on the way to Fountainhead Palace. Once you've scored a posture death blow once, you can hop up to the trees, wait a moment, and then score a stealth kill. No such luck here though. Trying to isolate Gander is possible, and he can be effectively herded into the tight passages around the scaffolding itself. The big dude has some cool moves too. His grab, where he flings you up into the air in a backbreaker, has this over-exaggerated animation quality to it. All Wrath of Heaven's animations have this stylistic choice, and it brings a lot of character to how everything moves. I can only best describe it as having an anime-like quality to it. You can't kill Gander in his current form, only Kagura. Aside from exploding her, grabbing works, but the most effective way is probably using the blowgun to firstly poison her. The convulsing animation enemies go through when poisoned leaves them open to attack, trivializing the battle. With Kagura down, you may think Gander's up next, but we've got a little help on that front. Tatsumaru appears once again and plunges his blade into Gander. Rikimaru seems surprised, for some reason, despite already having seen and realized that Tenrai brought him back to life. Now we've got a scrap. Tatsumaru's moveset is awesome. It's just visually slick, especially his lunging grab which rains blows on an opponent. Along with Onikage, I was always picking Tatsumaru in versus mode, as well as playing him in Time of the Assassins. Aside from the grab, Tatsumaru's moves are close to his original in Birth of the Stealth Assassins. His restrictions mirror yours though, lack of range. Much like Tatsumaru's narrative use in the game, this fight's over all too quickly. Tatsumaru's not about to simply die, no one ever really does, without dishing out a revelation. Within Rikimaru's right eye is the secret dojutsu technique. If the narrative track we began this journey on was a little shaky, we're heading off the rails now. This has never been mentioned before. Tatsumaru claims that Master Shionsai hid it, so it sounds like it was a technique that could be bestowed. The kanji consists of the kunyomi reading for hitomi, which is the pupil of the eye, and jutsu, which is a technique. I'm sure anyone who's ever seen Naruto can attest to that. So anyway, the pupil technique, or inner eye, or whatever you want to call it, what does it do? I guess we'll find out in a plot critical moment. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with the game's narrative. One character's narrative. Strap in. Tatsumaru dies. I've lost count of how many times, but it happens again. Tenrai exerts some form of control over Rikimaru. Why didn't he just do that earlier to make things easier? The sorcerer issues a final command to Rikimaru. Pay a visit to my fortress on the next full moon, for some reason. We end with a shot of a red glowing brain that I feel is somehow related to Mayo. If you're confused, I don't blame you. For grandmastering this level, you obtain the fireworks tool. You simply place these on the ground to set them off, and it causes anyone within its area of effect to gaze upwards. Like, it could have some utility if a guard was deliberately blocking your path, or you were going for an unseen run, but there are other better items in that case, and you'll need all the top shelf goods you can muster for the final assault. But before that, by now, we've seen the majority of what Wrath of Heaven has to offer as far as enemies go. Let's start this part off with some of the best enemy lines in no particular order.
I shall be back in another form. People always ask why, but they never ask why not. I see it passing by. Master sure likes his money. Insanity, treason, whatever. I choose not to live by your rules. Well, I really should be getting along.
Go ahead and run, coward! The blood of this ninja will stain your tatami and will rust my sword.
Gun. Show him what pain is, will you?
We can broadly divide enemies into human and non-human. On the human side, you've got your guards and enemy ninja. On the non-human sides, there are chibots, shikigami, and animals. In a sense, anything that plays a stealth kill animation falls into the former category, while everything else can be confined to the latter. The enemy design in Wrath of Heaven is the most complex when viewed from the number of moves that the enemy is capable of. If you strip that away, enemies broadly have all the familiar behaviors from previous games. Enemies transition through oblivious, cautious, and aware. They react to corpses and distractions, will attempt to hunt the player down if they are discovered, and can be just as easily manipulated. While there are advancements for the Tenchu series, we're not reaching the dynamic heights of MGS, which is understandable. The game needed to be more accessible and less punishing. If you look at other stealth-focused games around that time, Sons of Liberty, Hitman, and perhaps to a lesser extent Sly Cooper, they offer the player more leeway in not sticking to a pure stealth approach. Splinter Cell, on the other hand, is a purer stealth experience than Wrath of Heaven. In Wrath of Heaven, you can screw up and take on guards one-on-one without too much trouble. You may find yourself outnumbered 2-1, but there are few instances where enemies congregate in spaces greater than that. Technically, you could treat the game as an action combat experience, making it harder doing so. I'm sure there was someone out there who just wanted to abandon any notion of stealth and go commando on every enemy who dared cross their path. But with that in mind, you may find it strange that enemies now have a greater number of attacks. It's nothing spectacular, a few special moves, though if you're sticking to a purer stealth approach, you'll likely never see any of these moves outside of the versus mode. So which came first, adding special moves to enemies or the versus mode? If it were the former, it's peculiar because there's an expectation to encounter enemies and not leave them alive long enough to see half of these moves. In my playthroughs, I only ever really saw a handful of special moves: the Chibot's grenade attack, the monk's Tatsumaki Senpu Kyaku, and of course the boss's various special attacks. But if you dip into the versus mode, you'll notice the wealth of fun and flashy ways to drain your opponent's health. The inclusion of special moves feels a more vital component of the versus mode than of the game itself. Combined with the number of combat-focused special ninjutsu the protagonists learn, it's likely trying to have your cake and eat it. Tenchu's main campaign isn't meant to be played like Sekiro or Assassin's Creed. The design and combat foundation is absent, but we'll get to that soon enough. Enemy patrol patterns haven't evolved for the two previous games either. Was it in an attempt to simplify the experience, or was it just not given enough time to bake? Rarely do paths intersect, whether physically or by an enemy's line of sight. Patrols, while sometimes going along a circuitous route, rarely require any larger commitment than waiting until their back's turned. To the game's credit, like stealth assassins, guards love a good fake out to catch you unawares. It's a difficult balance to maintain. Wrath of Heaven is a quicker game. You can tear through levels much faster than previous entries. In making it more accessible, you want your player crouched for an inordinate amount of time waiting for that perfect moment, or do you want to foster a gameplay loop that's more akin to discover an enemy, wait for a moment until their back's turned, go in for the kill? I'm on the side of the enemy behavior being a deliberate choice in order to lower the barrier to what the game considers fun: stealth killing enemies. Wrath of Heaven does go ways to progressing its own brand of stealth gameplay. In several missions, you're restricted in what you can kill, such as the Graveyard's Undead, whether stealth is optional, like in Gota's Castle, or forced to engage in another form of progression rather than simply heading from A to B, like in Ayame's stone-smashing escapades when she visits the graveyard. Utilizing enemies that can't be traditionally killed does ratchet tension and difficulty, as does enforcing stealth. The same with escaping Amagai Castle. Wrath of Heaven flirts with changing up the formula, but it's a rarity. Enemies, their patrol patterns, and general AI behavior are still back where they were in Birth of the Stealth Assassins. There are modifiers around them as part of the level, but it's little more than that. On the whole, every enemy can be dealt with the same, even those found in Rikimaru's final level. It's been 2 days since we visited the Buddha temple and the full moon has risen. Rikimaru must now head to Tenrai's fortress and finish the job. How do we know where Tenrai's fortress is? Don't worry about that. Tenrai sent it via telepathy or something. The fortress consists of 2 parts. The first sees you land on a beach, marred by the desiccated bones of destroyed ships. On the one hand, Tenrai wants Rikimaru to pay him a visit, but still deploys his guards to stop him. I can only imagine it masquerading as a test of some kind. You'll discover all the greatest hits of enemies so far: red and blue jonin, kunoichi, martial arts monks, the whole gang's putting in a shift. The initial area is characterized by large open spaces that have 1 or more enemies on patrol. Your path, unlike previous levels, is quite linear. Wrath of Heaven handles its open spaces much better than Birth of the Stealth Assassins. The compositions of the area and its clutter are not only more visually interesting, but provide different stealth opportunities. There's a lot of fun to be had in the main area here, simply hunting down foes, avoiding their patrols, methodically clearing out everyone in order to unlock your final and most badass ability. But badass as it may be, it's an ultimate rule of cool technique. Wrath of Heaven functions as an insta-kill in most cases if it hits your opponent. Rikimaru will charge up the skill, leaving him vulnerable, and then lunge forward towards a foe. Regardless if this hits or misses, he'll be reduced to 1 hit point. If it hits the enemy, it will drain the life force from them, so you don't get it back in HP, and then strike them with a bolt of divine lightning. It looks sick. However, utilizing it is a big risk best reserved for bosses. To be at its most effective, you want to first knock the target down and then charge it so you can get them on the wake up. With Wrath of Heaven now yours, you can continue across the gully in the middle of the area, stealthing enemies along the way to inflate your score in case you mess up. Moving on from this location heralds your first steps into the fortress itself, with the cliff walls giving way to smooth stone. This is the main artillery wing of the fortress. Giant cannons poke through murder holes in the brick. Thick, mangled roots from hidden trees writhe around pathways and walls. As I did in Birth of the Stealth Assassins, I can't help examine the location under a practical light, thinking, how'd they shift boxes in there? What about if someone asked you to move a cannon, or just navigate from one area to the next? You'd have to be an acrobat. Interesting gameplay, totally. Practicality, 0. You eventually reach a hulking iron gate, marking the end of the level and another encounter with a former corpse. Of course, it wouldn't be a penultimate level if Onikage wasn't waiting for us. The two have very little to say to each other before the swords and feet come flying out. Not much has changed from our previous encounter, though you are afforded more space to brawl. He's quick, but the Fugaku blade can actually work in your favour in this encounter because of its reach. All in all, as long as you don't allow him the space to heal, he won't cause too much of a problem. Rather hilariously, upon defeat, you may think he'd follow the trend of previous encounters by just bleeding out on the floor while spouting off some antagonisms. You'd be right. Onikage does lament his situation, but then throws himself off the edge of the area, only to explode. But surely he can't come back from that, right? Before we can move on to the second half of the final level, there's another Grandmaster item to gain, the decoy whistle. It works as it did in previous games, which is still quite counterintuitive. You may expect it to function like Snake's knocking in MGS, however, it effectively resets an enemy's caution stage back to neutral. It certainly has its uses, but it's more a reactive tool than a proactive one. You get one more chance to stock up on items before venturing inside Tenrai's fortress. As you might expect, there's a boss battle on the horizon, so you may want your Hakama stuffed with healing potions and ninja rebirths, even a suit of armor, along with a few explosives for good measure. Aesthetically, there are two distinct parallels. One is the slow descent into evil like in the graveyard, which is depicted through the gradually changing environment. The other is the number of direct callbacks to Mayo's lair at the end of Stealth Assassins. The level itself is quite linear, with a few offshoots to pilfer items. You'll find the martial arts monks and jonin in abundance here too. If you can take your eyes off the bloodstained walls, you may well notice the deformed corpses chained to them. While I understand they were going for a particular aesthetic in the fortress, I do wish it had a bit more visual variety. The seemingly endless drab grey walls do feel a little samey after a while. As is the case with development, it's not uncommon for these later levels, or later parts of games in general, to get less attention than what comes before them. Still, the area does offer some platforming to shake things up, often alternating between tight corridors and open spaces. On a level of challenge, it's comparatively easier than Stealth Assassin's final level. I don't think any of the games really came close to the original in terms of stealth difficulty. The level soundtrack deserves a shout out too. It's a mixture of militarized drumming and droning flutes, mixed with dusty electronic haze in the background. The timing changes about halfway through, capturing an unease spell as you stealth around this bloody fortress. About halfway through, and I'm not sure why, you'll enter a kind of reddish, hellish room adorned with scripture on the walls. I'm not sure the significance of it, though it is quite striking. The remainder of the level is rather straightforward. I can't get over those giant skulls though. I'd say they belong to whatever's chained up along the walls. I can only imagine they maybe belong to the Manji cultists or this giant demon thing that Ayame fights in her story. Upon reaching the final stone doorway, it's time to tangle with Tenrai. Turns out, despite Rikimaru's many passes, Tenrai is still simping for him. There's a peculiar, I wouldn't go as far to say translation error, but an oddity. In the English, Tenrai refers to Tatsumaru as Rikimaru's brother. In a sense, he's correct, but the word used in the previous game, as well as the one used in Wrath of Heaven, is Anideshi. In this context, it means Rikimaru and Tatsumaru were brothers in that they studied under the same master. For the uninitiated player, they may take it at face value, thinking family. Whether this was done intentionally to make the relationship easier to both articulate and understand for the viewer, I can't say. Tenrai could have said, or succeed where your clan brother failed. I reckon that would have done the job just as well. Anyway, fraternity aside, the sorcerer wants the Azuma ninja and the power of dojutsu, whatever that is, on his side. Of course, we already know what the outcome of this little chat is going to be. Or do we? Yes, we do, to a degree. If you recall, way back when we were busy fending off the undead for Resai in the graveyard, we were asked to make a choice. Do we want to use the Shishisto sword to fix Izayoi or regular steel? Simply put, if you use the steel from the Shishisto, what would normally be a 2-round battle becomes a 3-round battle. That's it. However, in the final round, you are basically invulnerable to all of Tenrai's attacks, so really, it's costing you more time than anything else. The first round with Tenrai sees him utilize a number of attacks. He can randomly toss out lightning that will strike the ground, employ a stalagmite from Tales of Symphonia that you need to sidestep,
Stalagmite!
unleash icicle spears, or just whack you when you're up close. Ideally, you want to keep pressuring him up close so he can't wield his magic. Of course, as we said, one round ain't going to be enough. After the first round's done, Tenrai beseeches Meo to bestow him with more power. The Lord Beyond the Portal complies, and we're now facing a fired up Tenrai, who has a more bestial look. He's effectively invincible for a little while, so your focus is on mainly staying alive and avoiding his attacks. Rikimaru's unable to damage Tenrai, and it looks like the sorcerer has finally got the upper hand. The world begins to turn black. Out of the darkness comes Tatsumaru's voice, urging Rikimaru to use his right eye. It appears that the power of dojutsu is just what was needed to break Tenrai's hold and turn the tide. In this state, we're finally able to dish out some damage, when not avoiding his 360-degree ground pound, or the grab where he swings you around like a ragdoll. If you want to end the fight as poetically as possible, and why wouldn't you, it's a cool time to unleash Wrath of Heaven on Tenrai. There's a lot of risk with executing the move, so if you time it just after you've knocked Tenrai down, you often have enough breathing room to pull it off. Regardless if you use the Shishisto or not, the ending plays out relatively the same. Tenrai is seemingly undefeated. He leaps into the air, aiming one final blow at Rikimaru. However, his plan doesn't quite work out. For some inexplicable reason, Sekiya and Goda stroll into Tenrai's lair. They discover that Rikimaru has driven Izayoi through his own chest to kill Tenrai, and Tenrai split in two. I don't get it. Ayame then appears, rushing over to check on Rikimaru, who has somehow managed to miss skewering anything vital. Appearing to shrug off this mortal wound, Rikimaru has fulfilled his duty, bringing an end to Tenrai's plan. It wouldn't be a Tenchu game without some fate at the end, and hey look, it's Onikage, and he brought a friend in Meo.
I grow tired of delay, of waiting in darkness. You may now amuse yourself to your heart's content, my lord. The time has come.
Through the Portal is a bizarre level. It's canon, and it's inspired by a real-world event. Years ago, Tadayuki Horie, Kodama-san, and Kuwasashi-san were visiting E3, the game convention in LA. They'd rented a car. On one occasion, they'd parked up, left the car, and when they returned, found it had been broken into. Their passports, wallets, and more importantly, game data, all gone. So they had to visit the LAPD. The experience of visiting the police station and America itself would go on to influence Through the Portal. The level itself sees Rikimaru spat out into an industrial, dystopian version of the US, though it's never explicitly stated. How'd he get here? When Rikimaru had leapt into the portal at the end of Stealth Assassins in order to save himself, this is where he'd been whisked away to. In this place, a corporation was responsible for selling the cure to a deadly disease that they themselves had engineered. Recently, through government auditing, evidence of a giant fraudulent conspiracy had emerged. The company's CEO did not face justice. He'd managed to bribe his way out of jail, so you must punish the CEO. It's not the conceit of a company engineering a disease or that a CEO can bribe his way out of jail that strikes me as unbelievable. It's the fact that the government agency managed to uncover it. The level does not have the same level of polish that other missions possess, but that doesn't make it any less interesting. I quite enjoy all the claustrophobic pathways patrolled by comically obese guards spouting off English lines about donuts from heaven. I kinda wish some of the design ethos had been factored into a few of the game's main missions. The level's not a long affair. I'm amazed it was even created. When I look at this stage, I think you had to create all new assets for a level that most players will never even see. That's not to say I don't appreciate it. it's also true to canon in a sense. You don't have any of your ninja skills because Rikimaru hasn't learned them yet, and you don't get to choose your loadout. You get whatever Rikimaru had stuffed into his hakama at the end of Stealth Assassins. Rikimaru winds his way from the outer area of the building to the interior itself, and it's that exterior to interior transition that is something I feel was missing from Wrath of Heaven. Eventually, after infiltrating the building, you take the elevator to the penthouse and come face to face with Mr. CEO himself. It's perhaps one of the toughest boss battles in the game because he's got a lot of HP and you only have one ninja potion, and you don't have any of his skills. It's a fight where you need to cheese it as much as possible. Though his 2-slash combo is quite weak, his grab is quite powerful, and he also sports a ranged attack. I found that tossing caltrops down, having him run into one, and then unloading a 4-hit combo was the most effective method of punishing him. All in all, it's just strange, which Tenchu does quite well. If you do manage to beat the boss, you'll unlock Mr. CEO in the versus mode, though I never found him that great a character to play as. Killing the CEO triggers another worldly portal, which absorbs Rikimaru, but not his sword. Story-wise, this is the blade that shot down from the sky when Rikimaru returned for real from that portal. His sword, which is not Izayoi but something he picked up along the way. Anyway, with that, we're done with Rikimaru's tale. Only kinda. Where to begin with Rikimaru's story? Let's recap. His shadow visited the limestone cavern, listened to Mayo, jumped off a waterfall. Either beknownst to Lord Goda or with his consent, he uncovers a traitor, Nasu, and Echigoya's son, Tokabe, is killed by Onikage, who's now not dead for the umpteenth time. Rikimaru roots out the traitor. Ayame is just there, existing. Rikimaru heads back to the limestone cavern, which used to be Mayo's lair, where he confronts Onikage, kills him, but it was just his double. Then the real Onikage kills Rikimaru's shadow. Then the real Rikimaru kills Onikage, or did he, in this musical chairs plot of body doubles. Rikimaru rescues Kiku, kidnapped again. Hey Ayame, Izayoi needs a fixin'. Which steel should we use? Oh hey Tatsumaru, didn't you die too? Guess not. Let's kill Ayame's imposter. Remember her? What? The temple fortress is under siege? Couldn't go and liberate it myself, Rikimaru. Better go and sort that out. There's guys with baskets on their heads and gander and bears, oh my. It's Tatsumaru again. Your right eye, Rikimaru. Dojutsu. What's that? Never mind. Go kill Tenrai. Island fortress. Scary guys on the walls. Tenrai simping for Rikimaru. We fight. Rikimaru stabs himself. Tenrai splits in two like a Christmas cracker. I'll be fine. Game ends. Kind of a convoluted mess. My biggest gripe with the narrative touches on all three character stories. Instead of creating a siloed, three-pronged story, K2 should have just kept it to one plotline. While exploring different narratives could have potentially been interesting, you've got to be prepared to put in the work. With a limited text scroll and relatively short cutscenes, the plot is fighting for its life out here. Antagonists are barely introduced before we're hacking them up. Characters once integral fall to the wayside. Sekiya looks like he wandered out of Onimusha with his weird head and mustache. In Stealth Assassins, this was fine, because its reliance on narrative was so obviously threadbare. In Wrath of Heaven, there's a narrative which wants to be told, it just has no room to breathe. The biggest injustices were done to Onikage and Tatsumaru, the former because he has been Rikimaru's mirror during the series. He's just brought back in an extremely trivial manner. After Birth of the Stealth Assassins, there was a chance to really explore that dynamic. Instead, it's used more as a prop, or remember this? It's the same with Tatsumaru. They say he gets more of a look in for Ayame's story, while true, still absolutely wastes such an important character and does them a narrative disservice. Tatsumaru was a mentor and sworn brother to Rikimaru and Ayame. There's so much emotional weight to bringing him back that's simply discarded. He's dragged out on stage like decoration. The entire story structure, in its simplest form, is ripped from Stealth Assassins. I don't think that's a bad thing though. I do think Tenrai should have been dumped. I would have focused the narrative on Onikage and his attempts to revive Mayo. Imagine if it was him who brought back Tatsumaru to use as a weapon against Rikimaru and Ayame. If he was the one wielding his ninja knowledge to screw with the Azuma ninja instead of some guy we've never heard of with a beard and a cane. And that's what they kind of did in Tenchu 4. I get that K2's focus was more on gameplay and level design, it's great, but by wielding callbacks and homages without putting in the work, it results in them doing Birth of the Stealth Assassins a big disservice. At best, it's a skeleton to hang the game on. At worst, it actively hurts the game's legacy and is a waste of an opportunity. As it is, all these cool looking characters and their callbacks simply fall flat. Should we see if Ayame fares any better? If we quickly reel in all that narrative thread that was used to weave Rikimaru's story, we can soft reset and take a look at how Ayame's tale plays out. The story begins with showing the other side of Rikimaru's. While he went to investigate Echigoya's estate, Ayame went to track down the girls that had been used as collateral for the death. Just like the Buddha temple, the bamboo forest and the temple within are considered holy, meaning Goda and his forces can't infiltrate the area. I'm sure Goda is just making up the rules as he goes.
What? We've got another problem? Oh yeah, we can't go there because it's holy land. Yeah, real holy. Would love to help you guys out, but I'm afraid you're on your own on this one.
Another interesting tidbit between the English and Japanese release is that at the end of these pre-mission text scrolls, you get a few lines from Ayame, Rikimaru and the like to add a bit more flavour. Anyway, while we can gloss over the most minor events with levels going forward, save for the large narrative beats and differences, Ayame begins about halfway through where Rikimaru's jaunt through the bamboo forest took him. There are no Shikigami present, you'll just find regular guards. Your destination is the same, Shrine. Whereas Rikimaru fought Ayame's double here, Ayame discovers Taijima, the guy with the gun, playing what I assume is Koi Koi, a Japanese card game using Hanafuda, special Japanese playing cards. He's none too pleased that his game's been disturbed, though his charge is quick to make a break for it. Though the circumstances may differ, that doesn't stop it from kicking off. There's not much to say about the fight, except that you'll have an easier time in a wider, more open arena. Any illusion that you had of narrative convergence can now be well and truly abandoned. Ayame got a lead from Taijima, which has led us to Echigoya's estate. Both ninja start in the same location. I think it would have been cool to perhaps reverse the level or tailor events so that you're essentially working in reverse order to mix it up. The game attempts this, but only slightly. The choice of going via the underground waterway or sneaking through an extremely long tunnel remains the same. However, the first difference you'll notice is that because we already defeated Taijima, he's not waiting for us, thus altering the space-time continuum. Upon reaching Echigoya, we find Nasu, one of Lord Goda's men, lusting over a very different orb this time, one of the Jewels of Heaven. This one in particular is the Jewel of Earth. Apparently, there are 3 in total, and Echigoya's father had been searching for this one before he'd been dealt with in Stealth Assassins. The other divergence is in this battle with Nasu itself. Rikimaru had 3 enemies, including the boss, to take out, but Ayame does a bit of the hard work via a cutscene, leaving us to contend with Nasu alone. When he's good and dead, we get another callback to Stealth Assassin, more precisely, a slightly altered version of Rikimaru's original line.
Echigoya, where have you hidden?
Unfortunately for Echigoya, he's a little too good at hiding, but only from Ayame. Someone else has managed to sniff him out and shut him up before Ayame comes barreling in. Echigoya is dead and the Jewel of Earth's vanished, but who was behind it? Put a pin in this killer for now. We cut to a scene of Tenrai being all mysterious with his talking candles. Instead of focusing on Rikimaru and the Shishisto sword, he's now more interested in the Jewel of Heaven. For a while, the trail seemingly goes cold until Hamada, for reasons unbeknownst, takes his lords hostage, demanding he be brought the Jewel of Heaven. At the same time, a bunch of mysterious ninja lay siege to the castle. Whereas stealth was mandatory at the beginning of Rikimaru's level, here it's not. There is no Hamada to track down, only ninja to stealth. You'll make your way through the same tight hallways and interconnecting rooms as before to reach Goda's quarters. Here, Hamada has a blade to his former lord's throat. Through some fancy ninja skills, Ayame whips out a shuriken to create an opening for Goda to escape. Hamada's having none of it, seeming like a guy who's just had enough for one day. Fighting him is much like Nasu in that they're sword wielders. You can make things go much faster by simply having a few exploding arrows. They'll do the hard work for you. But despite broiling Hamada, he's not quite done yet. We're treated to a bit of VO as the next mission rolls around, where a ghostly voice rises from Hamada, taunting Ayame. It claims that the Jewel of Heaven will soon be theirs. I'm not sure how many missions it took for the story to go off the rails in Rikimaru's version of events, but we are clearly plummeting down a ravine here. The game claims that all 3 of the Jewels of Power once belonged to Goda's family and helped them control the realm. This makes no sense. It is law-breaking. I mentioned this in my Birth of the Stealth Assassins retrospective. I'll explain why this is law-breaking when it becomes relevant very soon. The game claims that 2 of these jewels were stolen long ago. When exactly? Ages ago, mate. Don't worry about it. Currently, Goda only holds the Jewel Virtue. This text crawl is insane. The longest in all the games. It is over 1.5 minutes. It's of similar length in the Japanese version too. Fearing that Tenrai's power of necromancy may be used against them, he dispatches Ayame to retrieve the Yoto swords. These blades
are spoken about in Goda's family diaries.
Tuesday, 1502, morning. I had a light breakfast of grilled fish and rice, then decided to create a pair of spiritual blades before lunch. Wednesday, 1502, evening. Realized creating inordinately powerful spiritual blades that consume the life of whoever wields them was not the best idea in hindsight. Have sealed them in an ancient graveyard surrounded by the reanimated dead. We shall never speak of this again. Had a light fish supper. Friday, 1503, morning. Just had a thought. If anyone, for some reason, needs to fight back against a supernatural threat or whatever, you have to destroy 5 seals in the shrine in order to access the blades. 8 a pair.
When that ridiculous text scroll is finally over, we can begin. The blades in question, according to the item selection screen at least, are Kasumi and Shizuku. Similar to Rikimaru's stint in Goda's castle, we're relying on stealth for the entirety of this mission. Without the blades, we're unable to damage the various undead shuffling through the graveyard, mixed in with the undead irregular guards, who are worth taking out to fill up your meter and unlock your next skill. However, there's no small risk in attempting this due to them often being in the same line of sight as the various fiends. Slightly hidden within each little assault course will be one of the stones you must destroy in order to progress further into the level. The metal slabs blocking pathways simply have numbered kanji written in blood. If this is your first time through the area, you'll no doubt have some trouble trying to sneak past the manji dancers and zombie soldiers. If you somehow intuited that the game won't just hand you the blades right away, you may have brought a few invisibility or ninja camouflage items along just in case. There's always a fine level between potentially making a level pure stealth without it becoming frustrating. This level's fair in the sense that you often have enough time and distance to formulate a path forward without feeling too much like you're trapped, but it can be a massive pain, and rightly so, if you're caught between a guard that you can kill and one that's undead. Your only choice is to scamper away, only returning once the situation has cooled down. It's only when you eventually arrive at the area where Rikimaru had his survival showdown that you can retrieve the Yoto swords. Along with some text explaining the life-stealing nature of the blades, you get a sentence about the earth trembling. Didn't have the budget for a cutscene, I reckon. In the Japanese version, you get a little more exposition at this point before a short clip plays that announces the boss's arrival. The boss design is certainly cool, I'll give them that. It's a giant armored and headless zombie thing wielding a meat cleaver. I think it's even larger than Gander. While its attacks are powerful, it swings pretty slowly and you can mostly get by simply strafing around the boss and unleashing your combos. All the while, however, your health will slowly trickle down. You only gain life from the Yoto swords upon defeating a foe. Though your HP doesn't decrease at a rapid rate, you can be caught out if a hit from the demon catches you off guard. Outside of this specific level, I struggle to think of a practical use for the swords in any other level unless you were going full combat for some reason, aside from the final levels. Obviously, replaying the level with the blades in your possession will make the whole ordeal a ton easier. I found myself after this mission asking why. Like, what was the point of this mission from a story perspective? Allegedly, the blades are to help battle Tenrai, but they are never employed or spoken of in the game again. We went all the way through that level for what? Nothing. Why not concoct any other narrative excuse to have a mission in the graveyard? Chuck a few suggestions in a hat and pull them out. Surely it's got to be better than what we got. But don't worry about that, Wrath of Heaven says. Put those Yoto swords away because it's been 2 months and we're still scouring the land for that Jewel of Heaven. Goda's investigations have led him to the Ronin village, more specifically the Red House of Zenosuke, who is supposedly a sage. While we begin this mission in the same zone as Rikimaru, we're not quite in the exact spot. As it was in his story, you'll find ninja prowling the rooftops and villagers meandering along the muddy streets. Save for the change from Ronin to ninja, as well as the slight mix-up in enemy layouts, the level is not too different regardless of character. It's obviously still a ton of fun to navigate your way through the zones, picking off ninja as you go, until eventually you arrive in the final area. During a previous playthrough, you may have taken note of the red building that stood out compared to the rest of the white ones. Now you can understand why. When Ayame slides open the door to Zenosuke's house, she finds the old man slumped forward, dead. Before she can investigate, she's forced to dodge a flung doctor's needle. Here we meet a shaved-headed, needle-wielding foe. We don't know who he is just yet, but he clearly worked for the old man. You head outside to scrap for a few moments before he calls the whole thing off after recognizing Ayame's fighting style. I guess that's a thing people can do. It's enough to stop the brawl, and the man shares his name, Tesshu Fujioka, the doctor. Once he's bolted into the night, we get another unexpected visitor, Rikimaru. Or is it?
In Rikimaru's story, Ayame's words gave the imposter away. For Ayame, it's the imposter, Yakubake's, lack of skill that allows her to see through his deception. This is the real boss of the level. You are essentially fighting Rikimaru, just as you did with Ayame. One positive is that it's fairly easy to run away if you need to heal up, though the same problem with the reach of your moves still persists. While Rikimaru doesn't have any direct attacking items, at least from what I saw, he can heal up like Onikage and prolong the battle if you're not careful. After defeating Hyakubake, it looks like Ayame can't catch a break. No sooner is he worm food, someone off screen fires a poison dart at Ayame, knocking her unconscious. Looks like we have Dr. Kimura to thank for that. Clearly, there's quite the divergence of plot having happened in such a relatively small level. Ayame was the one to defeat Hyakubake. We met Tesshu, who did not appear in Rikimaru's story, and it seems the princess isn't the one who's been captured for Ayame. While Ayame is chilling in a cell, we can brush up on our combat skills, and it wouldn't really be a Tenchu game without some questionable decisions around combat. Don't get me wrong, Wrath of Heaven's implementation of combat goes above and beyond the two previous entries, but there are a number of pitfalls in the moment-to-moment gameplay and the skills in your arsenal. Firstly, the range of your initial combo is too short. The general combat flow in Wrath of Heaven is, I take a move, you take a move. Focusing down your enemy up close or picking them off from afar are viable options, though the latter requires items. When you block an enemy's attack and go in for the punish, your first or second combo string will often miss or get blocked. While not a constant occurrence, it happens just enough to become annoying. The addition of a lock-on helps mitigate some of the frustration in encounters, however. It's best used in one-on-one battles where there's actually enough room to maneuver. The scraps players find themselves in while on a mission, you can usually get away with hammering square to neutralize a threat. Your run-of-the-mill enemies have basic attacks and a special at their disposal. In the majority of situations, it's always easier to stealth by or assassinate a foe. While the division of skills between combat and non-combat focused lands at around half, there's very stealth-focused ninjutsu. On the whole, we could categorize the shoulder thrust / somersault kick, ninjutsu block, grappling hook combo, ninja mind control, and Wrath of Heaven as pure combat focused. We're then left with Ninja Vision, Cling to Ceiling, Feign Death, and Wall Kick. Ninja Vision on the whole is pretty useless except for the rare Olympic blow dart archery session. Cling to Ceiling and Wall Kick often take more work to execute than simply assassinating an enemy. Feign Death is a waste of a skill slot. The skills in Wrath of Heaven brings the game close to breaking free of the item mold of the previous two games. In hindsight, they should have scrapped the items, not made more, and incorporated some of their functionality into the abilities a player can unlock. I've mentioned it time and time again in the other Tenchu retros, but Origami and Shadow Tactics absolutely nail this. Characters have finite special abilities that offer unique ways to emergently tackle problems in the game world. Invisibility, the blow dart, decoy whistle, the smoke bomb, these could have been repurposed into character abilities for Rikimaru, Ayame, and Tesshu to engender a more unique experience. Now, it's not simply a reskin of a few different moves for each level, but an individual set of skills that each character possesses. As it stands, the combat-focused nature of a large portion of your ninja techniques may give the player a false sense that outside of boss battles, taking on enemies traditionally is a viable strategy. If you've played the previous entries, you know that when it's a 2-on-1, the odds of you turning into a human pincushion skyrocket. It's the same in Wrath of Heaven. Sure, you may have a few more tools in your arsenal, but it's easy to slip into a position where enemies will gang up on you and proceed to stun lock. Boss encounters can literally be hit or miss. When you're up against a swordsman or close range fighter, there's more of a sense of a duel. Your Onikages or Tatsumarus can be quite enjoyable because you're forced to rely on blocking and strafing. On the flip side, bosses like Kimura and Tenrai can often be frustrating because of their AoE attacks and hypermobility. Your characters aren't really built to hound enemies. There's no gap closers or efficient ways to traverse longer distances quickly. While these fights are few and far between, it is frustrating after traveling through a level to get stun locked or clowned on by some boss intent on taking you to the Shadow Realm. Where combat does become extremely enjoyable is in the versus mode. Not for the great execution of skill on display by each opponent, but the sheer chaos that takes place in going ham on each other and rushing around for items. The first mode available is the versus mode. As you progress further through the game with each character, you'll unlock new characters to use in this mode. There are, I believe, 18 total characters available, with the 2 ninja dogs
being more secret characters. You and player 2 simply choose a character and then select a stage. With 6 in total, they all serve a slightly different purpose. Made with or lifted directly from the base game, the first 2 levels are the closest representations of real-world locales. The village and the battleground are areas dotted with several buildings and guards. Like a primitive PvE PvP game, the guards don't provide anything other than a distraction. Their purpose is to get in your way. The items around the level include both attack and support and actually provide quite an advantage if you can pick them up before you foe. The castle is modelled on Gorda's estate, replete with tight hallways present in the base game. You can easily get lost if you're both running around in an attempt to find each other, or if you prefer the more straightforward approach, just hop down into the central area and go at it. The cavern sees you in a portion of the limestone caverns, with a few areas for you to hop up to but no enemies in sight. If you're a character that has more maneuverability, then there's a clear advantage on your side. The remaining 2 stages, lifted from Tenry's Fortress, are much more stripped back experiences. The final stage is just an open space with nowhere to run, while the penultimate area is closer in design to the large open area in the first section of Tenry's Fortress. My preference was always for the first 2 levels because getting harried by guards and having them interrupt your fight provided tons of chaotic enjoyment. I vaguely recall managing to even get a few games online on Xbox Live way back in the day. Speaking of the character roster, not all are created equal. I have prepared a tier list of these characters. In the literal god tier is Chibot. This thing balls hard. Just seeing it menacingly hovering towards you, prepared to indiscriminately shower you with a hail of bullets, is no joke. Maneuverability may be trash, it floats for God's sake. As for its turning circle, I have seen a drunk grandma on one of those motorized rascals with more grace, but Chibot makes up for it. Its attacks are quick, it's got range, it doesn't get to use items, but Chibot don't need them. It is the item. It can eject bombs from some orifice, it can transform into a mobile turret like a Gundam, it can just start spinning to clear guards, it can fire while it's floating. This thing will tear it up. In the excellent tier, we have the usual suspect. Rikimaru is decent because of his moveset and ability to buy space with his shoulder barge and long string of combos. Ayame is extremely quick and can often get in a string of hits before you've had a chance to start an attack. Tatsumaru, while lacking in range, has a super quick and devastating attack string. His grab move is of course awesome and a pleasure to watch every time. From a pure base move perspective, he would edge out Rikimaru and Ayame, but he lacks some of their extra skills. Onikage may edge out Tatsumaru, as he fills the same niche, quick attacker with limited range. His base attack string, when combined with his roundhouses, really amp up the damage significantly. That's not even mentioning his hook kick for massive damage and his ability to drain health from a player through his special grab. Wrath of Heaven does this guy justice. But Jonin Red and Taijima may seem the odd ones out in this list, but they're not. The former has a pretty snappy attack, and his special grab, which can technically be continually chained to stun lock an opponent, makes him very deadly if cheesy. Taijima, though sporting poor attack range, is here mainly because of his flashy attacks. His grab, depending on the character model, delivers a gunshot to the stomach or blows off a character's pelvis, ending their bloodline. But it's his gunshot attack, which can be extended for several unblockable bullets. You can trap foes with this and really rack up damage. In the playable category, we have characters that are kinda meh but can get the job done in the right hand. Tesshu he's decent enough in the base game, but he's just too slow and lacks enough range to make him anything more than playable. His charge up strike is good if you can pull it off. His power up state has more utility, but he's just so damn slow he lacks great usability. Kenpo Geezer over here is actually pretty snappy despite his age. He's taken lessons from Street Fighter's Ken with his Tatsumaki, which he can perform from both jumping and neutral. His special Keyball cum Hadoken is both slow and weak to charge, so lacks any efficient use cases. Jinai you could call trash, but he makes up for it here by rule of cool alone. His special attack, which sees him slice an opponent and then sheath his blade, is simply too awesome not to use. His base attack string is woeful at just 2 hits, though his up-down attack has some range on it and is quite decent as a poke. In the trash category, we have characters that survive by virtue of them technically being able to cause damage. Kunoichi is literally a poorer version of Ayame. Her 3-hit string is woeful, and that's really all she has. I was surprised just how bad she is. One particular saving grace is that she's the only character in the game who has a legitimate air juggle outside of a grappling hook combo. If you crouch an attack and then immediately follow it up with a 3-string, it's actually not a bad combo. Mr. CEO is a pain to fight against in Through the Portal, but feels much weaker when you're controlling him. His grab attack is still his best move, and it looks sweet too. While not as slow as some other characters, his 2-hit normal is weak and his energy blast is pathetic.
Both Nasu and Hamada are big, lumbering fools. Hamada possesses an interesting stinger-like attack which can jettison a player across the stage, while Nasu has his signature groveling attack for a nice chunk of damage. Outside of that, they have nothing. Finally, Jonin Blue. The Claw Dudes and Dudettes from the first 2 games were actually quite deadly because they had ranged speed. Jonin Blue keeps the range, but his speed is glacial. He attacks through molasses. The only saving grace is his special, not because it's useful, but because it's hilarious. He'll light 2 grenades, rush around for a few seconds, then explode, obliterating anything close by. If I can't win, no one wins. The final tier in our list is the Kagura tier, created especially for Kagura. I would have loved for Ganda to be a playable character, or if her special move was to summon him for a period of time. There's a reason when you encounter Kagura in the game, she's accompanied by a companion to draw your aggro. It's because she's trash. Her warp dash for evasion, while an interesting concept, is nowhere near as powerful as her ability to teleport in the game. Likewise, her scroll attacks are far too slow and telegraphed to cause an issue. You can see her coming a mile off. She gets to sit at the bottom of the tier, stewing in failure. The second part of the multiplayer in Wrath of Heaven is somewhat difficult to evaluate because I had no one around at the time of recording to actually jump in and play it. In the co-op mode, you can visit those same levels as in Versus, but they've been kitted out with different missions. The biggest disappointment doesn't lie within the mode itself, but the potential that it shows. I don't know why Wrath of Heaven chose not to iterate on its mission design by including some of the modifiers present in co-op. Sure, collecting scrolls or protecting a wounded comrade may not be delving into the mind's originality, but they could have added an extra dimension to the experience. One thing I can't totally fault Birth of the Stealth Assassins for is that if you were hunting guards to increase your score, you had incentive to explore every nook and cranny of a level. It's not that I don't enjoy replaying levels, the multiple layouts are always welcome. I just think there was a ton of untapped potential. But as for these levels, they're quite bare bones, but not totally uninteresting. As I said, it's difficult to properly evaluate them or dredge up memories from years ago. I do like the sense of competition the score attack levels bring, and how on the castle stealth level, it's created in such a way as to really lend itself to test your ninja cunning. Likewise, in the cave level, where you're in a time attack scenario after drinking poison, they're interesting little ideas I wish had bled into the game to offer some more variety. Of course, it's easy to say that. I mean, there is dev time in creating content, and this is a game that was unable to offer more than a text-based tutorial. So it tells you that K2 was racing against the clock in some respects. Despite all that, the fact both Versus and Co-op modes are included in Wrath of Heaven at all was a surprising but welcome addition. Now back to the scheduled retrospective. Ayame awakes in a cell. As she's readying to make her great escape, the guard in front of her cries. Tesshu's turned up to break her out. Strange thing here is that when Kimaira captured Ayame, he had a ninja with him, but not his wooden army. The same seems to be true for who he has guarding the cell, which feels a little inconsistent. Anyway, Tesshu tells Ayame that Zonosuke was aware of a secret jewel being hidden in the eye of a statue at the Buddha temple. However, we won't be able to just slip through Amagai Castle's defenses so easily. Dr. Kimaira and Mahime have been listening in to our exchange and want us to stay here and play forever and ever. I'm not entirely sure why Kimaira abducted Ayame. Maybe he planned to interrogate her about the jewel, but then because Tesshu's let its location slip, she's not needed anymore? Either way, this level can be quite full on. We start with a battle against Kimaira and Mahime, so I hope you brought some explosives along. It's the same song and dance from Rikimaru's encounter. What's unusual is that after you've defeated the good doctor, he sets off a timer that floods the castle with poison gas. You now have 20 minutes to escape the castle by navigating its confusing hallways in an effort to reach the location where Rikimaru previously entered. Having a timer on the level does crank up the tension. If you've not played the mission in Rikimaru's story, then you may find yourself having a little stress, running to and fro in order to escape this hell dungeon. For the most part, you're best utilizing your map in order to track your progress and heading. If you're doing well for time and want to explore every nook and cranny of the castle, you can find a new weapon for Ayame, the Dokuto Blades. They're an interesting weapon in that when you draw them, they will poison you. While this fades after some time if you've not got an antidote on hand, the blades will then poison any enemy that's struck with them. Outside of fighting a boss, I don't really think you'd get much utility out of them. Ideally, you're stealth killing an enemy, so there's no benefit. It's a common problem that a number of the items from Wrath of Heaven share. When Ayame finally reaches the bowels of Amagai Castle, you get to see Rikimaru's point of entry. Approaching the circular recess in the room's center, a brief scene kicks in. This is a small cutscene in the Japanese release, but simply a text box here. Somehow, Onikage returned, as did Rikimaru too, who appears behind you, which means he was already in the castle. And why is he here? If Tesshu for some reason alerted Goda, They have a rule not to rescue captive ninja anyway. Was he chasing Onikage? And then Ayame straight up tells Rikimaru where the jewel is in front of Onikage. Maybe save that for when you're not in slapping distance from one of Tenrai's pawns. Anyway, this all boils down to a choice. Will you fight Onikage, or will you allow Rikimaru to do so in your stead? Like Rikimaru's story, it's more of a cosmetic change, the results of which won't become apparent for a little while yet. Fighting him is much like any other brawl with Onikage, though in this game, it's the only chance that you'll have to fight the demon when you're not playing as Rikimaru. Regardless if you and Onikage cross swords, your objective hasn't changed. Head to the Buddha temple and retrieve the Jewel of Heaven. Thanks to Ayame blabbing in front of Onikage, and remember, everywhere that one of Tenrai's minions are, Tenrai can both see and hear what is happening. He's dispatched Gander to the temple. Your mission is to execute Gander and then retrieve the jewel. Once again, we start the level with a boss battle against Gander. The giant is on his lonesome in this brawl. There is no Kagura to empower him. He still hits hard, has his grab moves, and can send you flying away with his giant staff, but you've got a much easier time navigating the arena than within the temple itself. You could, if you were so inclined, outfit yourself with the Dokuto blades to hasten his demise, but bringing some explosive arrows along is a much simpler option. The temple is just as good as it was with Rikimaru, lots of verticality, enemy patrols, and paths to take. You begin close to where Rikimaru also started, with your destination being that same temple. It's really a wasted opportunity. If you had started at the statue, I think it'd make more sense to have fought Gander there. Then the troops arrive and you have to make your escape. It's simple, but at least it's more compelling in creating a sense that you and Tenrai's army are on the race for these jewels. The narrative never quite captures any sense of urgency. What's worse is that when you eventually reach the statue, we meet an old friend. As I said before, both Onikage and Tatsumaru are absolutely wasted in Wrath of Heaven. More so Tatsumaru because of how he's so flippantly introduced. The last time Ayame saw him, he was thrusting Izayoi into his chest. The emotional weight had been so much that she'd thrown herself off a ship to die. Now Tatsumaru appears and there's just no weight to the scene. It's like, guess you're one of Tenrai's puppets now? I know ninja, especially how Ayame is being portrayed, are supposed to be emotionally attached, but it seems like this that have the ability to contrast it. We do see some of this vulnerability at the end, but the lack of setup or exploration between such a pivotal character returning is truly wasted. But Tatsumaru ends up stealing the Jewel of Heaven, leaving us in no better position than when we started this whole ordeal. Our mission was a failure, though we kind of brought it upon ourselves. Our penultimate mission takes us to the Limestone Cavern. Why? Well, it turns out that along with being Meio's former lair, it also has a passage that leads to Tenrai's island fortress. Kinda makes sense in that if Tenrai's whole shtick is bringing back Meio, he'd probably want to have him close at hand. However, it's still a little too convenient. In the process of rooting out Tenrai's location, Goda loses half his army. Even at the most conservative estimates, that has to be in the thousands. Seki is also being kidnapped and is currently being held at the Limestone Caverns too. It's our job to break him out. As we leave, Princess Kiku hands us her sister bells for good luck. This will come into play later. However, these sisters bells, like the name suggests, were a pair anyway. Ayame had one and Kiku had the other. There's no reason to give the bells over unless, for some reason, Ayame had returned them in between games. We begin this jaunt in the Limestone Cavern a short ways in from where Rikimaru started. While you can head back to that area, taking out ninja along the way, there's no real purpose for it unless you need to fill up your Kujin meter. Not a great deal's change from the previous go-round, though the enemy placements are deliberately tighter and have more interesting lines of sight. Along with the ninja in this level, you'll also encounter both Shikigami and dogs. It doesn't really shake up proceedings too much, but who could have created those Shikigami? If you recall, way back when Rikimaru rolled through here, he passed some cell-like cages after jumping to the lowest level. Here, Sekir is waiting for us. We are told that in order to actually access the path to Tenrai's fortress, we need to blast open the wall. My issue with Wrath of Heaven's narrative, well, another issue, is that it's like staring at an AI image. At a glance, as of 2024, it looks decent, but it doesn't hold up to scrutiny the more you examine the finer details. Like, the wall doesn't block the path, it's a wall, it's doing its job, so it's either debris that's blocking a path, or it's a hidden entrance that you need to reveal. Why have a secret path that just runs into a wall if you're not meant to have some method of shifting it? Also, how'd they discover it? Did someone tell them there was something behind the wall? Anyway, we need to find those explosives. In our search, we encounter more Shikigami and furry foes. With traditional stealth kills being ineffective,
you have to pick your method of assault a little more carefully. For some reason, the poison dart will work on spiritual paper, and I don't know how to feel about that. Surely it'd just poke a hole through the paper. When we reach the area where Shadow Rikimaru for Imposter Onikage, we can see the large boulder blocking the entrance. This makes it look more like an obstruction than a wall. After placing the explosives, you just hop out of the way of the blast. Once you've proceeded through the relatively small hallway, good luck getting an entire army through that, the path to Tenrai's fortress opens. Unfortunately, someone lets Sekiya wander about and a Shikigami tags him. The scene is slightly extended in the Japanese version, but by mere seconds. Sekiya legit dies here. He'll never reach an age where he can fill out the rest of his mustache. The culprit is, of course, Kaguya. Ayame's not about to let the sharp woman get away with it, but Kaguya has a large version of the furry wolves we've seen prowling the caverns. As in Rikimaru's battle in the Buddha Temple, it is a 2v1. The wolf is obviously pretty quick, and combined with a relatively compact arena, it's an encounter where the momentum can switch quickly. Bombs all the way for this one. Kaguya still has a low health pool, and the wolf serves as more of a distraction for the player. When Kaguya is finally down, and with the path to Tenrai's lair having been uncovered, it is time to enter the final stretch of Wrath of Heaven. Instead of rushing ahead, Ayame reports to Goda, telling him of the tunnel and Sekiya's demise. Having lost half of his forces already, he decides to hold a strategy meeting to consider the next steps. The results of their deliberation, surprise surprise, is that you will go in alone and assassinate Tenrai. Who would have thought? I like to think that meeting was nothing but a farce. As if Goda was like,
We all had a big chat, and all of us think that it's best if you, by yourself, just go in there and kind of sort it all out for us. We'll just, stay around here and offer emotional support.
There's very little difference from a level design or enemy layout perspective with Tenrai's Fortress. It's essentially the same mission. However, I do appreciate the addition of the Manji dancers here, just like they originally were in Stealth Assassins. The rub with these dudes is that you still can't kill them without the Yoto sword, so a few instances crop up where they can generally pose a problem to navigate around. As you progress further into the level, the repercussions of your choice in Amagai Castle come to fruition. Did you choose to fight Onikage or let Rikimaru handle him? At first, events play out the same. You cross the threshold into Tenrai's inner fortress to discover Tatsumaru waiting for you. On opposite sides of the conflict, regardless if he's being controlled, the two must still fight. For Ayame, this is the first time she's fought Tatsumaru. In this encounter, he's got everyone's favourite exploding arrow in his arsenal. Funnily enough, the issue he suffered from in Birth of the Stealth Assassins surface here again, his range. Strafing around him to bait out an attack chain, which you then punish, is the easiest method. Utilising the lanterns around the stage may also prove useful, if you don't fancy just focusing him down. When you deliver the final blow, the narrative splits. If you fought Onikage, he will reappear here. Of course, he plans to fight and kill you. Tatsumaru will be having none of that though. He'll latch onto Onikage, vowing to deliver them both back to hell by launching the two of them off the ledge. The two zombie fighters then explode, end scene. The more canon version of events, at least in my mind, happen if you leave Onikage to Rikimaru. After defeating Tatsumaru here, Ayame chooses to spare his life and Onikage doesn't appear. Ayame says she has a lot to catch up on with Tatsumaru, which, yeah, been a minute, and then she pops off to finish her mission. After a chance to restock your supplies, you appear in the heart of Tenrai's Fortress. Nothing's changed from before, so you can just zip through, ranking up your score as you go. I do think there was a missed opportunity in the approach to level design by not creating a large difference between scenarios. Outside of a few occasions, choosing a character is an aesthetic choice. Rarely does it impact gameplay. Taking this approach to level design may have posed an issue in the way levels were authored. While it's easy enough to simply work a back-to-front mission, trying to implement different entry points or level design that had the potential for modularity could have been a stretch too far. With that said, as I mentioned in Birth of the Stealth Assassins retrospective, even simple things like unique objectives for a mission, even if it was only to employ your tools in a certain way, would have cultivated more of a distinction between characters. When Ayame eventually reaches the sorcerer in question, and the two discuss manipulating condiments. This is the first time Ayame's actually seen Tenrai. All she had was a disembodied voice emerging from Hamada. At least Rikimaru had the courtesy extended to him. Tenrai aims to use the 3 jewels of power in order to control Mayo, and that's kind of the entire plan. Ayame's not really on board with it, so she'll obviously cross blades with Tenrai. The first portion of this fight is the same as Rikimaru's battle. It's just an old sorcerer with elemental magic. However, after the first round is over, Tenrai will absorb the power of the tool jewels in his possession in order to transform into some half-human Doc Connor's lizard man. The newfound power stops Ayame in her tracks. Unable to move, it seems like her life is forfeit. However, these sisters' bells in her possession begin to glow. Wouldn't you just know it? These sisters' bells were somehow the jewel of virtue. What? You're then fighting Tenrai, who chases you around the area like a Scooby-Doo villain. But wind it back to those sisters' bells. A while back, I'd said they were originally made by Princess Kiku's mother and Lord Goda's wife, Lady K. After Motohide killed Lady K, she handed the sisters' bells off to Ayame. During the events of Birth of the Stealth Assassins, Kiku shared one of the bells with Ayame. They're a set. Now, this is slightly retconned in Wrath of Heaven because Rikimaru now claims that the bells were originally forged with fragments of the Jewel of Virtue. I ain't buying it. On top of that, plot-wise, it's pretty convenient. If, say, the reason Tenrai had allowed them to find his secret base was explicitly so that Ayame and the sisters' bells would be hand-delivered to him, and then Ayame either broke free or the jewel saved her, that would have made more sense. As it stands, Tenrai just looks like a big green idiot. So Ayame ends up defeating Tenrai, but the changes don't quite stop there. In the version where Tatsumaru hugged Onikage so hard he exploded, Ayame's on her way to flee the fortress when, you guessed it, Onikage returned. He's not even charred. Raising his hand, which holds Tatsumaru's blade, he's poised to finish off Ayame. Why he didn't just boot her off a ledge, we'll never know. But as he brings the blade toward her heart, he stops, just in the nick of time. Rikimaru backstabs Onikage, vaporizing him. There is no way he's coming back this time. Rikimaru explains that the sisters' bells, or more accurately the Jewel of Virtue, functions as a limiter to the other jewels. Because the jewels were spoken of as a trio, I guess that having virtue realizes their power as a whole, but inherently works like a limiter? It's all rather poorly explained and feels like the lore was made up in order to fit plot events rather than actually mapping it out. It's just so frustrating because number one, that's a pretty poor ending, and two, there was room for some decent lore in there if more effort had been allocated. In the other ending, while feeling more aligned with canon, it is happy to include its own spoonful of insanity to make the medicine go down. Tenrai still calls on the power of the jewels, but when you defeat him, he chooses to sacrifice himself in order to resurrect Meo. So I guess two jewels were enough to unleash Meo, but not to unleash and control him. But then Tatsumaru and Rikimaru turn up. Tatsumaru has a box of explosives, which he intends to use somehow to blow up a magical interdimensional prison portal. Japan's explosives can transcend realms of being and still be effective. Tatsumaru chooses to jump into the portal with the explosives, giving a nod to Birth of the Stealth Assassins by shouting out his lover Kagami. Why couldn't he just yeet the explosives into the portal? Why did he have to jump in himself? Does him not being of this world mean something else happens when he blows up? None of this makes any sense, but it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to work, and it does. Both Tatsumaru and the portal are destroyed, and it looks cool, so there's that. Rikimaru helps Ayame out of there, and we flash forward to Ayame in the actual Azuma Ninja village, I believe. After receiving some backstory about the bells, which basically sums up what Rikimaru had said previously, we see Princess Kiku. Then, a few moments later, we discover that Goda's here too, accompanied by Sekiya, who is seemingly still alive. So, technically, this feels more like a complete good ending to Ayame's story, with her choices propagating a much greater impact on the plot. Don't get me wrong, they're both kinda crazy in their own way, with these events entirely incompatible with Rikimaru's versions of events. So at the end of the day, you're the one left with the ultimate choice of which story do I want to believe. If we're talking about which plot connects best with Tenchu 4, don't worry about it, mate. Probably Ayame's with the jewels and Sekiya surviving. I mean, Tenchu 4's plot's pretty mental, but one element we can always anchor ourselves to is Tenchu's soundtrack. Compared to the audio famine we endured in Birth of the Stealth Assassins, Noriyuki's returned and now we're eating pretty good in Wrath of Heaven. I mentioned back at the start of our journey that Japanese replaced the African language of Hausa as the game's opening lyrics in an effort to widen the song's popularity and appeal. Perhaps I would have revolted more if I didn't enjoy Sadame so much. It's not just my favourite Tenchu opening, but one of my favourite songs to open any game. It functions as an excellent hype man for the game, building from its melodic beginning to a crescendo met with a surge of powerful strings.
Sadame works as a microcosm of Noriyuki and his band's style. There's the traditional, the experimental, the rock influence, a bit of electronica in the drums, the Middle Eastern vibe. It's got it all and just complements the visuals so well. In the making of video, Noriyuki says that for Wrath of Heaven, he wanted to express the sense of tragedy and seeming futility of a ninja's existence. Warriors that fight from the shadows, their deeds and victories never to be lauded. That sense of melancholy is best captured in Sadame, while leaving enough room for experimentation in the various tracks that accompany each mission. Another element I love in a game soundtrack, probably why the original FF7 soundtrack is my favourite, is the use of leitmotif. At least, I think that's the correct word. You'll hear Sadame remixed and repurposed at different times in the game, whether it's choosing a character or Rikimaru going Super Saiyan.
Must concentrate.
This may be my only chance.
Impudent wench! I've still got more than enough power to destroy you!
There's also some redone classics, such as the boss battle music, and that awesome sting you get when Mayo's mentioned. A few of my favourite tracks include the revamped Punish the Evil Merchant track from Stealth Assassins that's received an electronic facelift this time around. Along with the level being a retread of the first game, if much improved, the music does a great job of connecting the old to the new. The track accompanying you in the Ronin village blends extremely well in Rikimaru's story with his progression to Amagai Castle. The former is a kind of electronic flamenco mixed with strings, and the latter goes hard into a western vibe to mirror the foreignness of the environment you're in. I'm sure that the little Chibok can pull off a tasty lick or two with those crazy robot arms.
What?
Familiar tracks return, such as the boss battle music, though I do miss the fact they left out Onikage's battle theme and replaced it with something that is admittedly cool, but just doesn't hit like the OG. As a return to experimental form, the tracks that assail you as you assault Tenrai's fortress also deserves a mention. While it begins with some light electronics and ambient sound, accompanied by foreboding woodwind, at around the halfway mark, militarized drums kick in before it descends into arabesque strings and guitar. The timing's weird and the styles somewhat clash, but I think its strangeness mirrors the absurdness of Tenrai's fortress. On the whole, while I don't think Wrath of Heaven's soundtrack reaches the heights of Stealth Assassins, it is a massive improvement over Birth of the Stealth Assassins. Noriyuki continues to do an excellent job of sonically complementing a level, evoking a ton of atmosphere, and leaving you with a very memorable collection of music. Our final character and story to explore is Tesshu, Doctor by day, contract killer by night. You would have encountered Tesshu briefly in Ayame's version of events, though his burgeoning rivalry with Rikimaru is more prominently featured in his own narrative. You unlock Tesshu by simply completing the game with both Rikimaru and Ayame, though he's displayed in the character select screen on Western versions, he's hidden in the Japanese release. Unlike the coyness around Tatsumaru in Birth of the Stealth Assassins, K2 and its devs took no such approach in Wrath of Heaven. In the behind the scenes video, Tadayuki Horie says they tried to create a character the whole family could enjoy, I assume from a narrative perspective, as his story exudes a Jidaigeki period drama vibe. Mitsuo Kodama also says that they had a lot of fun and freedom in creating Tesshu due to him not being a previously introduced character, but wanted to balance that with crafting a character that could fit into Tenchu's world. Tesshu plays quite differently from Rikimaru and Ayame. When you first get a hold of him, he feels much more not slow but purposeful in his movement. His weapons are primarily his fists, in a similar vein to Tatsumaru. His stealth kills see you breaking necks, snapping limbs, and tearing out unsuspecting guards' hearts. Another switch up you'll find when playing as Tesshu is how your loadout is approached. As a hired killer, Tesshu earns more from successfully completing jobs and taking down foes. Oftentimes, enemies will spew out cash like a fleshy piñata. You use this money to purchase items at the beginning of the stage and then sell back whatever stock you have left at the end. Along your journey, you'll also find money caches hidden in levels. If you reach a Master of Assassins rank, Tesshu's version of Grandmaster, then you will unlock new items. Tesshu's story begins much like any Tenchu plot kicking off, punishing an evil merchant. Whatever branch of the timeline Wrath of Heaven exists in, Echigoya is not having a good time. In this version of events, Goda has not moved to end Echigoya and Nasu's business of loan sharking. Tesshu, as part of an underground group of assassins, has been hired to take them out. Tesshu has no unique levels per se, though familiar levels are utilized differently, whether that be enemy layouts and number, where you begin, things like that. What makes Tesshu's levels some of the most enjoyable to play through is that the enemy numbers have been cranked way up. With denser enemies comes a greater need for caution when exploring levels. The instances of patrols intersecting or one guard being within another's line of sight happens a lot more frequently. And you know, it's always fun to tear through a level like an unseen Shikigami dispensing justice. Echigoya's estate plays out much like with Rikimaru and Ayame, acting as a good playground to test out your new character. While Tesshu does have a few unique abilities of his own, he also lacks a number that you may have become used to wielding. Gon are Ninja Vision, the Wall Attack, a traditional knockback move, Wrath of Heaven special attack. Instead, you retain Cling to Ceiling and gain moves like the Broken Animal Call, which will instantly de-aggro guards or innocents. This thing is far too OP. If you're ever caught, you can simply run around the nearest corner so the key meter transitions to caution, use the move, and they'll return to unaware. Tesshu also possesses a few unique items. The powerful bamboo gun functions quite similarly to the explosive arrow and will send enemies into orbit. His throwing needles function the same as the shuriken. His disguise is the same. The magazine functions like a poor man's rice ball, but his kumihimo is awesome. It's basically a long-range stealth kill. Fire it at an unsuspecting enemy and Tesshu will string them up like a duck in a butcher shop window. During your mission at Echigoya's estate, you'll eventually make your way into the main compound through more traditional means, the doors. On the first floor, you'll find Echigoya. Tesshu will use his two-fingered death jab in the back of his neck, after which one of the group's informants will tell us to hunt down Nasu. It seems the bodyguard Taijima has taken a night off, so you won't find him lying in wait along the way. Tesshu sneaks into Nasu's chambers just in time to hear Rikimaru slay Nasu and his cohorts before hopping out into the night. We then meet Zenosuke, leader of Muzan, the underground assassination organization. The boss leaves us with a warning: don't mess with the Azuma. So that's exactly what Tesshu does, and we end the game. Roll credit. But of course, Tesshu's pride gets the better of him. After enduring a sleepless night, he is determined to teach Rikimaru a lesson. And by teach him a lesson, I mean slaughter a swath of Goda's guards, effectively committing treason, which would surely make him one of the most wanted men in the land. I appreciate the intention of this level, it's just the execution. It feels like it should have been a stealth-only mission to reach Rikimaru and be like, hey, look at how easily I could have gotten to Goda. Instead, you can indiscriminately slaughter Goda's house guards and receive absolutely no repercussions for it. It's pretty baffling. I think they could have worked in the ninjas assaulting the castle into Tesshu's narrative. He arrives with the intention of showing up Rikimaru, only to end up helping. Then, in the end, he still wants to test his mettle. I don't know, it's just a strange setup, but I won't say no to racking up broken necks. You'll find the level a lot denser with guards, as is the general design philosophy with all of Tesshu's levels. Kami-sama help you if you end up allaying one of them, because you'll be dogpiled by Goda's retinue and have no choice but to flee. Aside from that, your destination hasn't changed. You're a moth drawn to the room's golden glow. Tesshu finds Rikimaru's kunai ready to greet him. Reflecting on it now, I don't know how Tesshu knew Rikimaru would be in the throne room. I suppose because he'd always be close to protecting Goda. This game makes me question a lot of things, but you obviously need to fight Rikimaru now, which isn't too much of a bother. The two come close to dealing killing blows but stop short. As recompense for the insanity, Rikimaru delivers one of his best lines of the game.
To light a candle is to cast a shadow.
I wasn't trying to kill you, Tesshu says after slaughtering dozens of guards. He leaves Rikimaru with some parting words. If they meet again, one of them will die. 6 months have passed since Tesshu's botched job at Echigoji's estate when he finds himself with a new contract: assassinate the head of a religious cult that has overtaken a Buddhist temple on the outskirts of Goda's land. This is obviously the same temple that Goda did dispatch Rikimaru to when it was overtaken by Tenrai's forces, as well as that same location where one of the Jewels of Heaven was located. Ganda, who is, was, or may not even be one of Tenrai's lords, is now the leader of this cult. The big man has been implicated in the plot to sell village girls to neighbouring states, though he's evaded justice because of his religious profession. Historically, this can be seen as quite plausible. Religion held a lot of sway in 16th and 17th century Japan. I just find it strange that Ganda was never mentioned as a high priest before this. What's mad about this level is there is absolutely no preamble, no cutscene, no nothing. You're thrown straight into a battle with Ganda. If you thought the assassination would be the dessert, you thought wrong. The fight with Ganda is annoying. Tesshu's not particularly quick, nor is he gifted with great range. Lacking traditional gap closers, think DMC's Stinger, it's very difficult to gain ground. As I said in the section on combat, you're often forced to move in, thus opening you up for an attack. Bombs do come in handy against Ganda, but he has a boatload of health. What makes it worse is that the cult leader comes equipped with the ultimate short-range defense, the staff. He can just poke you when you get close or snap you up in his big burly arms to break your back. In the end, Ganda goes down without much fanfare. No cutscene, just a bit of text which reveals your next objective. Meet Senkichi by the waterfall. You'll be tackling this level in reverse order. If the missions, particularly this one, weren't so fun to navigate, I'd balk at the simple switch in starting point, but it works well. With Rikimaru or Ayame, this level's all about forging upwards. Now, we're gradually creeping further into its depths. Oh yeah, and if you die with Tesshu, his game over screen is metal as fuck. When you reach your destination, you don't find Senkichi, but some other dudes instead. Several bad dudes with swords and a badder dude leading them, Jinai. A former member of Muzan, Jinai is now in cahoots with Tenrai. In Rikimaru's story, Jinai's men inhabit the Ronin village. Ayame tangles with him at an abandoned temple, if you're playing Return from Darkness, where him and his cool hat play a much larger role in Tesshu's story. The Ronin captures Tesshu and locks him up in the limestone caverns. Jinai has no intention of killing Tesshu, just yet anyway. In fact, he has a job for him: kill Zenosuke, leader of Muzan. Tesshu refuses to assassinate his boss, so Jinai is content to let him rot in a cell. That fate doesn't sit too well with Tesshu, who's stashed a needle away for just such an occasion. After escaping his cell, manned by the most oblivious guard in the world, Tesshu needs to get his tools back and make a swift exit. We're close to the end portion of the limestone cavern, so you guessed it, we're navigating this level in reverse. Collecting your items is not necessary, only retrieving a key which has been conveniently left by one package. Again, I'm a simple man. If there are a lot of enemies, my brain blesses me with the good chemicals. What I do find particularly amusing about this level is that your exit point is the space that housed Meo's portal if you're Rikimaru, or a passage to Tenrai's fortress if you're Ayame, but it's now an escape route for Tesshu. Assuming Tesshu was able to tiptoe out of Tenrai's fortress and swim back to shore, he's struck by a foreboding pang of intuition. In the mission crawl, it's framed as an almost supernatural affliction that's part of his backstory, though it's never mentioned before or after this again. In failing to rendezvous with Senkichi by the waterfall, there's an old dead drop by the house in the cemetery. Man, this place is a hotspot for giant armor-wearing zombies, mythical metal, and now a place where assassins hang out. This is perhaps my favourite incarnation of the cemetery level. No demons to worry about, just live dudes about to become the undead. Back to front, the mission still possesses the gimmick where the area's doors will clang shut behind you, blocking any return. There's not a great deal to say about the level that isn't represented in the game's various missions. However, this is the first time I've seen a guard actively jump on its patrol, which is pretty cool. Wish that was used more. If you're playing the Japanese version, you'll see one of the different looking and admittedly cooler guards here as well. Close to reaching the house, we see Senkichi stumbling through the rain in a panic, only to be swiftly cut down by someone who kind of looks like Jinai. Funnily enough, in the Japanese version, they do narrow the frame in order to better hide the killer's face. Without preamble, you zip up through an opening in the tunnel to discover Senkichi and end the mission. Only one thing left to do now. We're paying a visit to Zenosuke. The old dude should know what to do. What I find peculiar about this mission is that you don't start with a cutscene. Instead, you're placed near the red house, which is the end of the level for Rikimaru and Ayame, of course. You must then hop over a couple of roofs in order to reach it. If you like, you can rove around taking out enemy ninja before stopping by. Zenosuke has one final job for us, and he's the client. We're to take out Jinai and his men. The old boss is hanging up his guns, content to retire, or more fittingly, expire. Zenosuke offers Tesshu a strained goodbye before the assassin leaves. The old man then promptly keels over, a large blade having been thrust into his back. Mustn't be too comfortable attempting to converse with that thing protruding from your spine though. In Ayame's story, she'd been to visit Zenosuke in order to discover more about one of the jewels of heaven. When she entered, she found the old man dead, minus the sword, and Tesshu hiding in the rafters. The two then stepped out for a scrap, but sorted things out in the end. I much prefer Tesshu's telling of events. There's an unspoken understanding between the two men that Zenosuke is dying, and Tesshu comports himself with a cooler, if no less round head. It's a nice bit of character growth from the hothead he was with Rikimaru earlier. Unfortunately, it's the same hot-headedness that lends itself to the altercation with Ayame being perhaps more canon. We must now finally confront Jinai. This sees Tesshu navigate through the Ronin village's compartmentalized areas, full to the brim with Jinai's crew. Another personal favourite level, I do wish that one of the variant levels offered to Rikimaru and Ayame went in with an ethos of just packing as many enemies in as possible. When you reach the initial starting area, you'll find only Jinai waiting for you. The time for words has long passed and the two duke it out in the village. The space naturally offers a lot of breathing room atop buildings because enemies can't or simply won't pursue you. Jinai himself has quite a limited moveset, a double slash, and that's about it. He technically has a cool special move and a ranged attack, but doesn't like to use them for whatever reason. Like most battles, bridging the gap towards your opponent is often a delicate game of footsie, but Jinai doesn't have too much health for a final boss. If it weren't clear already, Jinai is a twin. The one we just dispatched was Ukyo, while the other, the real mastermind, is Sakyo. The moth we saw in Zenosuke's house appears here as a callback, though Tesshu spares it this time. When the Jinai twins were part of Muzan, one would act as bait while the other went in for the kill. Now it's time to end the lineage. The fight, aside from a wardrobe change, is identical to the one you just fought. Both twins share not only features but movesets. It was in this battle, low on health, that for the first time I took advantage of an enemy's weapon, the spear. Despite its limited moveset, it's extremely useful because it bestows you with the range that your normal attacks sorely lack. With this great spear of cheese, you can finally defeat Sakyo. In the cold embrace of death and Tesshu, Sakyo reveals one last trick up his sleeve. This place is gonna blow. I don't know how much explosives you'd need to level an entire village, seems like overkill, but he's brought them. Why not just lure Tesshu here and then blow it up? I guess we'll never know. The guards get the drop on Tesshu again, and he's skewered. It'll take more than that to kill the good doctor though. Noriyuki engages that wah pedal for some funky riffs to play us out, and Tesshu drops a fire line to compete with the now smouldering village.
Another moth that wanted to be a firefly.
In the final scenes, we see Tesshu hasn't quit his day or night job just yet. As Rikimaru discovers his handiwork, it seems like there will always be a market to take down those criminals that fall through the cracks of justice, if you've got the coin. What shines through most of all about Tesshu's story is that his personality has provided an opportunity to shine, more so than Rikimaru or Ayame. It's in no small part thanks to the veteran Cam Clark providing the VO, and his tale being a much tighter, shorter affair. Both producer and director touched on the freedom they felt when developing the character and his narrative. Put into the context of struggling with the pressure that came from trying to do Rikimaru and Ayame justice, they perhaps didn't go far enough with the classic Tenchu characters through fear of doing them injustice. Wrath of Heaven's VO has some interesting picks to say the least. There are staples of the craft such as Cam Clark, Quentin Flynn, Jennifer Hale, and D. Bradley Baker, as well as a few you may find surprising, like Daniel Day Kim and Earl Bowen. Daniel Day Kim as Rikimaru is passable. I think he gets shortchanged by the limited amount of dialogue that's sent his way.
What the hell?
It's the same with Michelle Krusiek as Ayame. There's just not enough to grade them on. Cam Clark as Tesshu, by the way the story's handled, is given more time to act. Despite the questionable attempt to inflect a foreign twang to his performance is certainly more memorable than Rikimaru or Ayame. Quentin Flynn as Tatsumaru again doesn't really get a look in, and like most of the cast, is given little to work with. He's the voice of Raiden in MGS and has worked on a bunch of other stuff, so I'm not doubting his chops. If you needed some evidence that a game's story can be hamstrung by the VO in the game, Wrath of Heaven is your proof of that. Trying to ferret out who exactly played who in the game was actually pretty difficult. Your usual staples of IMDb or behind the voice actor kind of come up empty. Jennifer Hale's listed in the credits, but I still have no idea who she voiced. Maybe Kagura? I can't imagine someone of her pedigree voicing a guard, and she's pretty high up on the credits too. IMDb listed her as Keiken, and I cannot for the life of me figure out who that's supposed to be. And it's not that you can put too much stock in IMDb because they've got Michael Go as Gohida instead of Goda. James Sai is credited as a voice, and as of 2024, you may remember him for voicing Hojo in Final Fantasy Remake and Rebirth. Oboen returns as the voice of the narrator, as he did in Tenchu 2. You may know him as LeChuck from Monkey Island or Dr. Silverman from the Terminator series. His baritone narration was one of my more vivid memories of the game. I assume that Ken Yong played Tenrai? By name, I wouldn't have recognized the guy, but you show me a picture of Mr. Wu from Deadwood, and now we're talking.
Sucker. One. No two.
All in all, the VO for Wrath of Heaven is extremely underutilized because the game's narrative makes no room for it. As such, there are fewer memorable performances like Birth of the Stealth Assassin, and less so bad they're good performances as there was in Stealth Assassins. After all these years, it's the random death barks from the enemies that live in my head rent-free. Oftentimes, the easiest way to understand which narrative or ending of a game is canon is by looking to the next game. However, Tenchu 4 doesn't provide that luxury. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe it directly references anything from the previous game, so we're left to our own devices to attempt to understand which of Wrath of Heaven's divergent narrative threads we could weave into the series' tapestry. Here's my take. Our story begins with Rikimaru's shadow emerging from the cave, having manifested itself through ninjutsu. This is not dojutsu. It's stated in the game that his shadow is part of a shinobi's mystical arsenal. Jesus, dojutsu. Anyway, the real Rikimaru is busy in a dystopian future, battling a corrupt CEO. Meanwhile, Ayame has been following the trail of those responsible for capturing girls from Goda's land, leading her to the bamboo forest where she encounters Taijima. He serves as the link to both Nasu and Echigoya in revealing that the two have been running a loan sharking business, preying on vulnerable villagers struggling to make ends meet during the aftermath of the war at the end of Stealth Assassins. The instability in the land makes the work of Zenosuke and his cadre of assassins not lacking in customers. Enter Tesshu. The boss has dispatched him to Echigoya's estate in order to assassinate Nasu and Tokabe. Off he goes. At the estate, Tokabe is showing off his jewel of power to Nasu. Unbeknownst to the two men, a ninja and hitman have infiltrated the estate. Ayame works her way through the estate to find Echigoya Jr. and Nasu. Tokabe flees, leaving Ayame to deal with Nasu. Once she's dealt with him, it seems like someone else ferreted Tokabe out and finished the job for her. No, not Tesshu, but Onikage. Him and his extra long foot executed the corrupt minister. Unfortunately for Tesshu, he's not getting that paycheck. Disappointed, the boss tells him not to tangle with the Azuma ninja and let it lie. In our definitive version, Tesshu does not act like a mass murderer and chooses to let it go. With news of the Jewel of Power fresh in her mind, Ayame rushes back to Goda Castle, only to find it infiltrated with enemy ninja. While she thinks it's too late, another ninja, claiming to be the supposedly dead Rikimaru, has miraculously put the threat down. Upon his return, he located and killed the traitorous Hamada, who attempted to take Goda hostage while spouting some nonsense about a Jewel of Power. That sounds familiar to Ayame. With all this talk of mystical artifacts, the cogs in the ninjas' heads start to turn. Fragments of limestone were found on the clothes of the ones who assaulted Goda's castle. Rikimaru's just popped out of a portal there. Maybe Mayo's got a hand in this. He decides to go and check out the limestone cabin, while Ayame, on obtaining a lead from Goda himself, is going to pay a visit to the Red House of Zenosuke in the Ronin village. But how's Tesshu getting on? Some time has passed since his job was sniped from under him, but he's got another lead. Turns out that Nasu and Tokabe were in league with some mystical priest who's been making his home at the Buddha temple. What seems like a normal job is anything but. Ganda, the leader of these zealots, just so happens to be one of Tenrai's 6 lords. He's made a contract with Nasu and Echigoya, promising them riches for their dirty dealings in order to get close to Tokabe and divine the location of one of the jewels of power. After arriving at the temple, Tesshu battles Ganda, defeating him. Just as he's patting himself on the back for a job well done, he's ambushed when arriving to meet Senkichi, the boss's middleman. Jinai's been one step ahead of him all this time and drags him off to the limestone cavern and bangs him up. Meanwhile, Rikimaru embarked on a mission to those very same caverns. Tesshu's not made it here quite yet, though the ninja does find it inhabited by both Jinai's network of ninja and Tenrai's demonic forces. His spelunking in the cavern unearths the Shishisto sword. This is where we first discover that Onikage is back from the dead, and that he's been resurrected by the mysterious Tenrai. Despite Onikage's attempts to resurrect his master, he only succeeds in summoning the real Rikimaru. In this subsequent battle, Izayoi suffers a chip, but Rikimaru is able to secure the sword before Onikage pieces out. After the dust has settled in the caverns, Jinai attempts to convince Tesshu to turn his back on the boss. Of course, he refuses, and Jinai is happy to let him die. However, Tesshu has a few tricks and lockpick up his sleeve. Once freed from his cell, he escapes the caverns, intent on getting to Zenosuke before Jinai. Around this time, Ayame has set off to the Ronin village in the hopes of finding Zenosuke. Unfortunately, she only finds Jinai's ninja out for blood. Working her way through the village, she discovers the house of Zenosuke. The old man's there, but he's been assassinated. Tesshu appears from the woodwork and, after a brief battle, calls off the fight. He knows not to tangle with the Azuma and who's really responsible for the boss's death, Jinai. With no leads, it seems Ayame's going away empty-handed, but Tesshu's willing to share some information about his latest target and the strange jewel encased in the Buddha's eye. Though he'd love to stick around, he just added a new name to his hit list, remember. He makes his way to the opposite end of the village, a stage for the final showdown with another of Tenrai's lords. Despite killing Jinai, his brother Sakio appears, ready for round 2. Tesshu emerges victorious once again, but suffers a harsh wound before taking a limping victory lap as the village goes up in smoke, bringing to an end his story. Now we're left with Rikimaru and Ayame's narrative to wrap up. Intent on rushing to the Buddha temple and locating the next jewel, Ayame's trapped by Dr. Kimura and carted off to Amagai Castle. The good doctor's planning a little playtime with Mahime in order to extract the location of a jewel of power he believes is in Goda's possession. Rikimaru, not ready to rescue an injured this time around, has more important business to attend to, like fixing Izayoi. I think canon Rikimaru would know the dangers of the Shishisto sword and not want to use the thing, so instead chooses the other option. While in the graveyard, Kagura had previously summoned her army of the dead to claw back Meio's blade. Tenrai himself is still simping for Rikimaru, so upon seeing Rikimaru's skill displayed in the limestone cavern and his ability to beat back the undead hordes, he appears to him here, minus Tatsumaru because it makes no sense. Rikimaru obviously turns him down. Upon returning to Goda Castle, he learns that Ayame had recently attempted an attack on Goda's life in search of the jewel, and then fled. Rikimaru has been able to track her down to the bamboo grove. He ventures into the snowy locale, locating Ayame, who turns out to be a fake. From Hyakubake, Rikimaru learns that Ayame was captured by Dr. Kimura and is currently imprisoned at Amagai Castle. Given that this involves the Jewels of Power, Goda is willing to allow Ninja Protocol to slide once again, like he did in the original game. Rikimaru makes a beeline for Amagai Castle via the Ronin village. Meanwhile, Ayame is tangling with the Doctor and Mahime. Upon their defeat, she's forced to flee the castle before it self-destructs. Upon reaching its exit, she runs into Rikimaru and Onikage. Rikimaru will handle the demon, while Ayame can continue her original mission of visiting the Buddha temple to retrieve the jewel. Rikimaru and Onikage clash once again. The demon pieces out again, still alive. At the temple, Ayame fights with Tenrai's guards, who are here to secure the jewel that Ganda had originally been sent to retrieve before Tesshu put paid to that. When she reaches the statue, Tatsumaru is waiting for her. The two fight before he makes off with the jewel. Now Tenrai has 2 of the 3 jewels of power. Rikimaru, on the other hand, tails Onikage when the demon flees the castle. Unbeknownst to the 2 ninja, Seki has been captured in the limestone caverns. It's revealed that after an investigation into where the girls were being taken, it was via some secret passage in the caverns. I don't know, Goda does some work on his end for once and finds this out. I'm winging it. Rikimaru starts a little deeper in the cavern than his previous visit, the holding chamber where Tesshu was held. He proceeds with Sekiya, grabs the explosives, opens up the ridiculously small passage to Tenrai's fortress, but then has to deal with Kagura and her wolf. Seki is injured by one of her Shikigami, but it's implied that he's not mortally wounded. Terrible decision. With the secret passage, which was used to transport the girls, remember, now open, it doesn't make sense for a whole ass army to shuffle side by side. Goda uses his brain to stage an approach by sea after divining the location from properly scouting the area. The approach by sea will serve as a distraction while both Rikimaru and Ayame secretly assault the fortress. Ayame already has her sister spells, so there's no need for Kiku to hand one over because we're respecting the law. She also skips getting traumatized this time around too. Both ninja have the same mission, assassinate Tenrai. Ayame's journey sees her tangling with Tatsumaru for a final time and choosing to let him live, but Tenrai opts to snuff his lights out as he explains the power of the Sisters Bells. This is a choice that you can encounter depending on your actions in Amagai Castle, but we're sticking to just one definitive plot. Rikimaru, of course, clashes with Onikage. The result of their fight is that Onikage chooses to fake his death because he's basically given up on Tenrai's plans and discovered the sorcerer would rather control Meo than resurrect him. The final showdown with Meo is split into two parts. Rikimaru weakens him first, but he then draws on the 2 jewels of power in order to go Super Saiyan. It's now that Ayame's Sisters Bells react, weakening Tenrai. She opts to finish him off after Rikimaru's been weakened. As much as I would love that ludicrous ending with Tatsumaru jumping into a portal to be canon, no, just no. Let's go for the ending where Tenrai is seemingly defeated by Ayame, only before he appears from the sky like Izoyoi, forcing Rikimaru to plunge his own blade into his chest to snap the guy in twain like a Kit Kat. The 2 ninja walk out of the fortress, a job well done. Of course, we get the credits and then the reveal that Onikage is still kicking, which leads into Tenchu 4, where, spoilers, he's the main antagonist. That is a hurried and by no means perfect melding together of all plot threads. I'm sure the pacing and a bunch of other stuff could use some work, but it's at least a potentially more coherent and compelling narrative than what we got. But you dance with the one you came with. After Wrath of Heaven's release, K2 worked on Return from Darkness for the Xbox, then Tenchu Kurenai, which is set between Wrath of Heaven and Stealth Assassins. The final Tenchu game the company would work on was Tenchu Z, or Tenchu Senran as it was known in Japan, for the Xbox 360. Wrath of Heaven, at least according to VG charts, which we can say is questionable, sits at around 1.1 million units sold for the PlayStation 2 version of the game. If those numbers are close to reality, then you would have imagined that the game would have been heralded as a success by Activision. It's difficult to understand whether Activision had faith in this series because, for those that have played Kurenai can attest to, it is a much smaller game in scope and budget. Senran technically feels more like an actual mainline game in the series, though it marked the final time K2 would work on the franchise. After that, the company worked on a couple of other releases before being absorbed into Capcom. K2 helped develop X-Troopers, the Resident Evil HD remaster ports for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, amongst others along the way. Why did a desire for Tenchu cool after Tenchu Z? Well, again, according to VG charts, Z only shifted around 340,000 copies, way down from the others in the series. Those sales could have been expected. Microsoft had a vested interest in trying to court the Japanese market back then by hoovering up exclusives for the platform. I would assume that also came with Microsoft footing a portion of the bill for the game's development. Unfortunately, Tenchu Z wasn't doing itself any favours by being a lesser game in many respects than its predecessors. I certainly remember Wrath of Heaven fondly, and I'd say a number of other people do too. As far as I'm aware, it's sitting on From Software's shelf, gathering dust. Who knows if it'll ever see the light of day again, but lucky for stealth fans, there have continued to be releases that capture what I'd call the spirit of Tenchu, games like Aragami and Shadow Tactics, even Sekiro. The reality is that stealth games are niche. Those that break into the mainstream don't tout sneaking around as their core gameplay mechanic. It's simply one mechanic of many. To survive, you have to adapt, and it's given us some amazing games, but there's still a part of me that wants to see Rikimaru and Ayame step out of the shadows once more. And with that, we have reached the end of the Tenchu retrospective. If you want to go ahead and give it a like or subscribe to this video, feel free to do it. But until next time, take it easy.